There's a short scene in the season 6 finale of Regular Show where Mordecai stands in front of a room full of wedding guests, mid-speech, telling everyone that he does not know who his soulmate is, and he never once looks at the girlfriend sitting a few feet away who he is, in that exact moment, breaking up with. It is one of the ugliest things he ever does across the whole run of the series, and almost nobody outside the fandom's back rooms ever really talks through how he got there. Tonight, on Velvo, we're going through the whole arc, season by season, from the version of him you probably remember fondly, to the version fans still argue about online, and we're going to be honest about what the series actually intended, what changed behind the scenes, and what just slipped through the cracks along the way. So get comfortable, we'll be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed, it really does help us keep making these. Before any of the romantic wreckage, before the wedding speech and the storm cloud girlfriend, and the letter about honesty that never should have been read out loud in front of anyone, there was a much simpler version of this character. And it's worth spending real time there before we start tracking the decline, because you can't see what changed if you don't first sit with what he used to be. Regular Show begins with two groundskeepers at a park neither of them particularly wanted to work at, hired by a man named Pops who turns out, eventually, to be a great deal stranger than a park owner's son has any right to be. Though that's a story for a different night. Mordecai is a tall blue jay with a talent he's mostly too embarrassed to pursue seriously, a habit of getting swept into disasters that started as errands, and a best friend, Rigby, who is basically incapable of doing anything the easy way. Regular Show's premise, from its very first episode, is deceptively small. Two guys don't want to mow a lawn, and then, almost immediately, that premise stops being small at all. The first episode, The Power, lays the template for basically the entire series, and it pays to be precise about what actually happens in it, because this is one of those Regular Show stories that gets misremembered a lot, including on this channel before, so let's get it exactly right this time. Rigby, avoiding work as usual, steals a strange keyboard sitting on a park bench from a wizard who had set it down for a moment while he stepped into a bush to relieve himself. That's it. That's where the object comes from. It isn't found abandoned. It isn't inherited. It isn't handed down by anyone. It's stolen, in broad daylight, from a distracted wizard who was mid-bathroom break. Mordecai names the keyboard The Power, works out that it grants basically any verbal command you give it, and the two of them use it for small, harmless things at first, the way anyone would if they suddenly had reality bending in their pocket. And then, because this is Regular Show, harmless small requests spiral into something that accidentally launches their coworker Skips onto the surface of the moon. Benson, the perpetually furious park manager, confiscates the keyboard once he understands what it actually is, hands it over to Skips, and Skips destroys it by the end of the episode. It never comes back. It's a one-episode object, and its entire purpose is to establish, right out of the gate, what kind of show this is going to be. And that's really the thing to understand about Regular Show, before you can understand what happened to Mordecai specifically. This is a show that treats the mundane and the cosmic as adjacent, not opposite. A missed shift turns into a moon landing. A grudge match over a video game turns into a battle for a friend's soul. A simple crush on a coffee shop employee eventually becomes tangled up with a storm elemental and a decade-spanning custody dispute over which version of a relationship gets to be real. The show never treats this escalation as strange within its own logic. Characters register the absurdity. Sure, there's always a beat where somebody says some version of, "This is insane." But nobody in this universe seems especially surprised that insane things keep happening to two guys who cut grass for a living. That tonal contract, ordinary premise, escalating stakes, characters who roll with it because rolling with it is the joke, is the load-bearing structure the whole show sits on. And it's worth naming clearly once here, because it will come back up again and again as we go season by season, without needing to re-explain it every time. Within that structure, in these first 2 years on the air, Mordecai occupies a specific and pretty likable role. He is, relative to Rigby, the more mature one. Not mature in some absolute sense. He still lies to impress people, still gets swept into Rigby's terrible ideas roughly as often as he resists them, still spends an enormous amount of his mental energy on a woman he's too nervous to talk to properly. But mature relative to his best friend, who treats every task, every responsibility, every hint of consequence as something to be avoided by any means necessary. Mordecai wants, in a low-key way that the series doesn't overplay in these early years, to be good at his job, or at least to be seen as good at his job. He wants Benson to stop yelling at him specifically, even while he tacitly signs up for whatever scheme Rigby's cooking up that week. And underneath all of it, there's this quieter thread about him wanting to be an artist, wanting to paint. A thread regular show plants early and mostly leaves alone for long stretches, which in hindsight is one of the more elegant pieces of setup in the whole series, because it pays off in a very specific way by the time we get all the way to the finale. The comedy of this early Mordecai works because he's positioned as the relatable one. He's the audience surrogate, dragged through absurdity by a friend who has close to zero interest in normal adult responsibility. When something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, Mordecai's default reaction in these seasons tends to be some mix of exasperation and grim competence. He complains, he panics a little, and then he handles it, or at least tries to, because somebody has to. That's an appealing shape for a comedic lead. It gives you someone to root for without asking you to admire him unconditionally. He's flawed in small human ways, insecure, a little vain about his art, prone to showing off in front of women he likes and immediately regretting it, but he's not yet flawed in ways that make you actively frustrated with him as a person. There's a difference between a character who's a mess in an endearing way and a character who's a mess in a way that starts to curdle your sympathy. And for these first couple of years, regular show keeps Mordecai squarely on the endearing side of that line. Margaret Smith enters the picture early, working at the local coffee shop, and Mordecai's reaction to her is immediate and thoroughly, almost embarrassingly sincere. This isn't a slow burn built on years of familiarity. It's a crush at first sight, the kind that makes a grown Blue Jay stammer and improvise elaborate excuses just to stand near the counter a few extra seconds. What's notable about how the show handles this in its first stretch is the tone. It plays Mordecai's nervousness for very real, very specific comedy. The over-rehearsed lines that fall apart the second she actually looks at him, the panicked lies about why he's suddenly at the coffee shop again, the visible relief when a conversation goes even slightly well. But it never really mocks the feeling itself. The series seems to take the crush seriously as a feeling, even while it's laughing at the way he handles it. That balance, sincerity underneath absurdity, is something regular show does well across a lot of its runtime, and it's arguably the single biggest reason the Margaret storyline became the emotional spine so many fans attached themselves to in the first place. You believe that this dumb bird actually likes this woman, even while you're laughing at how badly he's playing it. Let me pause here to talk about Rigby too. Not because this is a video about Rigby, but because you cannot really talk about what happens to Mordecai later without understanding what he's positioned against in these early years. Rigby is chaos. He avoids work with an almost religious commitment. He schemes. He lies reflexively and badly. He treats every disagreement as a wrestling match waiting to happen. And crucially, in these first 2 seasons, the series is pretty clear about which of the two of them is supposed to be the steadying influence. It's Mordecai. When their increasingly deranged workplace situations threaten to spiral completely out of control, it's usually Mordecai pumping the brakes, or at least attempting to, even if he usually loses that argument and gets dragged along anyway. That dynamic, the reluctant, semi-responsible friend paired with the gleeful agent of chaos, is a classic sitcom shape for a reason. It works, and it specifically requires Mordecai to hold down one end of that seesaw. He has to be the one who, even while going along with the insanity, seems like he knows better. That's the version of Mordecai this whole video is measuring everything else against. Not because these first 2 seasons are flawless. They aren't, and treating any era of a show that ran for 8 years as some untouchable golden age is its own kind of dishonesty. But because this is the baseline fans keep referring back to when they talk about what later seasons supposedly lost. A guy who's a little insecure, a little cowardly about his own feelings, prone to embarrassing himself in front of the woman he likes, but fundamentally decent, fundamentally the more grounded half of his friendship with Rigby, and fundamentally, someone regular show trusted its audience to like without asking them to forgive very much. What's interesting, and this is really my own read on it, rather than anything the show states outright, is that this version of Mordecai works specifically because his interior life is mostly implied rather than dramatized. We don't get long scenes of him processing his feelings about Margaret in these early years, not in the way later seasons will eventually give us. We get reaction shots. We get him fumbling a sentence. We get him staring a beat too long. Regular show trusts a raised eyebrow and a stammered word to do the emotional work, and honestly, that restraint suits both the character and the format. Regular show at its best in this stretch is an 11-minute cartoon about workplace nonsense that happens to have a sweet, understated crush plot humming underneath it. Not a show that's decided the crush plot needs to be the main event. That balance is going to shift, gradually, and then not so gradually, as we move forward. And figuring out exactly where and why that shift happens is really what the rest of tonight is about. There's also something worth saying honestly here before we move on, which is that a lot of what people remember fondly about this era is really a memory of proportion, rather than a memory of perfection. Season 1 is 12 episodes. Season 2 nearly triples that. Across that stretch, Mordecai isn't written with some flawless, internally consistent psychology. He's written episode to episode, gag to gag, the way most animated comedies from this period were written, with continuity treated as a loose suggestion rather than a contract. The reason this era reads as more likable in hindsight isn't that the writers had cracked some perfect formula for his character and then abandoned it. It's that the series hadn't yet decided to make his romantic life the thing the whole series measures its emotional stakes against. Once that decision gets made, and it gets made gradually rather than all at once, the same underlying traits, the insecurity, the tendency to avoid hard conversations, the vanity, start to read very differently, because now they're being asked to carry real dramatic weight instead of just fueling a joke every few episodes. That's the shape of the argument we're going to trace across the rest of this. Not that Mordecai was written badly later on in some crude, careless sense. The people making this show clearly cared about these characters the entire way through, right up to a finale that goes out of its way to give him a properly tender ending. The argument, and it is an argument, an interpretation, not a settled fact regular show ever states about itself, is that the balance shifted. The series leaned harder and harder into his romantic indecision as a source of drama rather than comedy, asked him to carry more emotional weight than his established personality could comfortably hold, and in doing that, slowly turned some of his most relatable flaws into something a lot of longtime fans came to find actively hard to watch. We're going to walk through exactly where that starts, season by season, and we're going to be honest the whole way through about which parts of this are things that demonstrably happen on screen, and which parts are just one way of reading them. So let's move into season 3, because that's where the actual romantic architecture of this character starts getting built in earnest, and where the first real cracks, depending on how you want to read them, start to show. Season 3 runs from the fall of 2011 into the fall of 2012, and by most measures, including a primetime Emmy, the show picked up for the episode Excellent. It's the year regular show is operating at its most confident. This is worth pausing on for a second, because it complicates the story we're about to tell. If this is truly one of the strongest stretches of the entire series creatively, and by most outside accounts it is, then whatever starts happening to Mordecai from here forward can't simply be explained as regular show losing its grip on quality across the board. Something more specific is going on with how his character gets used, even while the series around him is firing on all cylinders. The episode that matters most here is Yes Dude Yes, and it's the true starting point of everything we're going to spend the rest of tonight tracking, so it's worth walking through carefully. Mordecai sees Margaret from a distance, apparently in the middle of a marriage proposal. He doesn't get close enough to hear anything, doesn't ask a single clarifying question, just sees enough to convince himself his crush is over before it ever really began, and he collapses into the kind of theatrical devastation that a show like this can only really play for comedy. Rigby, in an attempt to help, signs him up for an online dating profile, and through that profile, Mordecai meets someone named CJ, short for Cloudy J, who turns out to be a literal storm cloud in the shape of a young woman. It's a strange, fantastical premise for a love interest, even by this show's standards, but it's introduced with a lightness that keeps it from feeling like a big dramatic swing. She's charming, a little intense, prone to sudden mood swings that manifest as actual weather, and Mordecai, freshly heartbroken over a misunderstanding he never bothered to check, starts seeing her. Then, because farce is the engine of this particular episode, he manages to invite both Margaret and CJ to the same movie on the same night. a mistake so avoidable and so entirely his own fault that it's almost impossible not to laugh at how badly he's mishandling two relationships at once before either of them has really started. CJ finds out, and this is the moment worth lingering on, because it's the first real preview of a pattern we're going to come back to again and again across this video. CJ doesn't just get upset, she transforms, in the most literal sense the series can manage, into an actual storm, tearing through the coffee shop, wrecking the place, her hurt made into weather, because that's simply what she is. It takes Mordecai talking her down, patiently and for real, to bring her back from that. And in the middle of all this, Margaret clears up the original misunderstanding herself. It wasn't a proposal, it was her cousin. The entire crisis, the double-booked date, the destroyed coffee shop, the storm cloud girlfriend he's now stumbled into a relationship with, all of it traces back to Mordecai seeing something from a distance and never once asking a follow-up question. I think this episode is a properly clever piece of writing, and it helps to say so plainly before we start being critical of what comes later, because regular show earns a lot of goodwill here that it's going to spend down over the next several years. Yes Dude Yes works because it never pretends Mordecai's romantic instincts are reliable. It builds an entire storyline out of the premise that this guy jumps to conclusions, avoids hard conversations, and lets his own anxiety write stories in his head that turn out to be almost entirely wrong. That's a real character flaw, dramatized honestly, and crucially, regular show doesn't ask you to feel sorry for him about it. It asks you to laugh, because the consequences here are contained to a single episode, a wrecked coffee shop, an embarrassing double date, a storm he has to personally calm down. Nobody gets permanently hurt. Nobody's trust gets shattered in a way that can't be repaired within 22 minutes. The flaw is real, but the stakes are still comedic. That's an important distinction to hold on to, because a big part of what changes over the next several seasons isn't that Mordecai suddenly develops new flaws nobody saw coming. It's that the exact same flaw, jumping to conclusions, avoiding the hard conversation, letting anxiety do his thinking for him, keeps getting redeployed in situations with progressively higher and more permanent stakes, until the joke stops landing as a joke and starts landing as something closer to a genuine character indictment. The same season also gives us Fists of Justice, and I want to be exact about what this episode actually is, because it gets misremembered sometimes, including, frankly, on this very channel in the past. So let's set the record straight here and now. This is not a romance episode. It has nothing to do with proms, nothing to do with Margaret or CJ. It's a fantasy action episode, full stop, in which Mordecai and Rigby end up wielding a pair of magic gauntlets and stepping in to fight a recurring cosmic threat named Clorgbane the Destroyer, standing in for their friend Skips, who has history with that particular villain that goes back a very long way and belongs to an entirely different story than the one we're telling tonight. What matters for our purposes is simply that this episode exists as further proof of how comfortably regular show could pivot within a single season between small-scale romantic farce and full-blown mythic stakes, without either mode undercutting the other. It's a versatile show at this point in its run, confident enough to let Mordecai be goofy and heartbroken in one episode, and then hand him a magic weapon to fight an ancient evil the next, and have both feel like they belong to the same universe. Season 3 ends with Bad Kiss, and this episode is the one that actually plants the seed for everything we're going to spend the middle stretch of tonight working through. Mordecai and Margaret finally kiss. It's the moment the show has been building toward, gently, since it first put her behind that coffee shop counter. And then it's immediately undercut, because his breath, understandably, is terrible in the moment, and the kiss becomes something closer to an embarrassment than the sweep-off-your-feet moment either of them presumably imagined. Rigby, because of course it's Rigby, has access to a cheap, homemade time machine, and the two of them use it to try to fix the situation, which introduces a piece of the series' internal logic worth naming clearly here, since it comes up again later. Destroying or resetting these little time machines effectively unwinds whatever happened in the stretch of time they'd been used to travel through. It's not treated as some rigorously worked-out physics system. It's treated the way a lot of regular shows' fantastical mechanics are treated, as a loose, almost throwaway rule that exists to serve whatever story is being told in that particular episode, rather than a hard boundary the writers feel bound to going forward. The kiss gets undone. It doesn't count, not really. Not in the way fans came to talk about it afterward. which meant that whatever this relationship was building toward still had, as far as the series was concerned, a real first kiss left to deliver, somewhere down the road. Here's my honest read on this stretch of the series, and I'll flag clearly that this is interpretation, not something regular show states about itself anywhere. Season 3 is the version of this love triangle at its healthiest, precisely because it's still being told mostly as comedy rather than as ongoing drama. CJ's introduction is played as farce. Margaret's near miss with the cousin misunderstanding is played as farce. Even the botched first kiss is played, fundamentally, as a joke about bad breath rather than a meditation on romantic disappointment. Regular show trusts these beats to be funny first and meaningful second, and because of that, Mordecai's very real flaws, the jumping to conclusions, the anxiety, the tendency to avoid clarity in favor of assumption, get to exist without asking the audience to sit in judgment of him. You laugh at the mess he's made, rather than wince at it. That's a hard balance to strike, and Season 3 strikes it about as well as this show ever manages. What's worth watching for as we move forward is exactly when and how that balance starts to tip. Because the ingredients are all already sitting right here, on the table, by the end of Season 3. A love triangle between a childhood crush and a supernatural new girlfriend. A pattern of Mordecai avoiding hard conversations in favor of assumptions. A relationship that technically hasn't had its real first kiss yet, because regular show erased the one it gave us. Every piece of the machinery that eventually produces a wedding hijacking and a devastated Stormcloud girl running out of a chapel is already in place by the time Season 3 wraps. The question the rest of this video is really asking is what happens when the series stops treating these ingredients as material for farce and starts treating them as material for actual, sustained emotional drama. Because that's the shift that changes how audiences experience this character, more than any single bad episode ever could on its own. Season 4 is where that shift starts to happen in earnest, and it happens, somewhat cruelly, at the exact moment the show is more popular than it will ever be again. Nielsen numbers aren't the kind of thing you'd normally build an emotional argument around, but they matter here, because Season 4 is objectively the high point of regular show's live broadcast audience. The premiere, Exit 9B, pulled in the largest audience the series would ever draw for a single episode, somewhere north of 3 million viewers. And it's worth remembering that this is the season that most people who casually remember watching this show on television growing up were probably actually watching. Whatever version of Mordecai gets written this year is, in a very real sense, the version that reached the widest audience the series would ever have. Exit 9B itself picks the season up by reusing the same cheap time machine from the previous season's finale, sending Mordecai and Rigby forward a couple of months to discover the rest of the park staff has been brainwashed by a villain in their absence, which is a fun, high-energy way to open a season and mostly stays in regular show's comfortable wheelhouse of workplace disaster escalating into something much bigger. It's not really a Mordecai character episode in the way we're tracking tonight. More a demonstration that regular show could still open a season with pure, confident chaos. Where things actually move forward for our purposes is later in the season, with picking up Margaret. Mordecai drives Margaret to the airport. She's got a college interview, the kind of ordinary, low-stakes errand that this show has built an entire structure around escalating into something much larger, except this time it doesn't escalate into a fantasy plot at all. It stays small, and it stays sincere. At the gate, she kisses him. And this is generally understood, both by how the show treats it afterward and by how fans have talked about it ever since, as the real first kiss, the one that counts, unlike the fumbled, retroactively erased attempt from the previous season's finale. It's a lovely piece of writing, low-key, unforced, letting two characters who've been circling each other for years finally just have a moment that isn't undercut by bad breath or a time travel gimmick. If you wanted a single scene to point to as evidence that this show, even this deep into its run, still knew exactly how to earn a quiet emotional beat without leaning on spectacle, this would be a strong candidate. Later in the same season, Meteor Moves gives the relationship another tender beat, a kiss shared during a meteor shower, with Margaret admitting, in the moment, that Mordecai is the person she'd miss most if her life took her somewhere else. It's a lovely scene, and in hindsight it's also a quiet piece of foreshadowing, dropped in the middle of what otherwise plays as pure romantic sweetness, for exactly what's coming at the end of the season. Because Stake Me Amadeus, the Season 4 finale, is where this particular relationship actually breaks, and it pays to walk through carefully. because I think it's one of the best written pieces of heartbreak this show ever produces, precisely because of what it doesn't do. Mordecai plans an elaborate, fancy dinner, working up the nerve to finally ask Margaret to be his official girlfriend, a step the series has been circling for 4 years at this point. And instead of a yes, he gets Margaret, in tears, telling him she can't, because she's been accepted to her dream school, a place called Milton University, and she's leaving. It's not a betrayal. It's not a misunderstanding he could have avoided by asking one more question. It's not a flaw of his own making at all. It's just life, ordinary and unfair, arriving at the worst possible moment, the way it actually does for people, and taking something away from him that he did absolutely nothing to deserve losing. I think this episode gets slightly underrated in a lot of conversations about this show's romantic writing, precisely because it's overshadowed by the messier, more controversial beats that come later. But Stake Me Amadeus is, in my opinion, the high watermark for how regular show handles Mordecai's romantic pain. It hurts. It's properly sad, one of the more affecting endings this show manages across its whole run. And crucially, it asks nothing of him except to feel that pain honestly, on screen, without turning it into an indictment of his character. He didn't do anything wrong here. He wasn't selfish, wasn't avoidant, wasn't hiding anything from anyone. He simply loved someone whose life, quite reasonably, pulled her in a different direction, and regular show lets that be enough of a story on its own, without needing to manufacture a flaw in him to justify the sadness. That distinction matters enormously for where we're headed next, so it's worth stating plainly. This is the version of heartbroken Mordecai that works completely, and it works because the show resists the temptation to make the breakup partly his fault. Compare that, and we will be comparing it directly before this video is over, to what happens 2 seasons later, when a very similar shape of story, a relationship ending painfully in a season finale, gets told again, except this time with the blame landing squarely and uncomfortably on him. The gap between those 2 finales is, more than almost anything else in this whole timeline, the clearest single measurement of how the writing around this character actually shifted. There's also something worth saying honestly about how Season 4 handles the broader shape of this romance, which is that it's patient in a way later seasons don't really replicate. 4 years of real-world time pass between Margaret's introduction and this first genuine, uncomplicated kiss at the airport gate. That's an unusually long runway for a will-they-won't-they plot on a kid's cartoon, and the series earns the payoff precisely because it never rushes it, never manufactures artificial obstacles just to keep the tension alive, and lets the eventual heartbreak land as something that actually costs the audience something, because we've spent 4 years hoping this would work out. None of this is to say Season 4 is some kind of flawless creative peak that regular shows simply fell off a cliff from afterward. Plenty of fans and even some professional critics would tell you the seasons that follow have real strengths of their own, and we'll get into that honestly later. But if you're specifically tracking Mordecai, and specifically tracking whether the series is using his romantic life as a source of earned sympathy or as a source of character indictment, Season 4 is the last stretch where the answer is cleanly, unambiguously the former. What comes next starts to blur that line, and it starts to blur it through a character introduced back in Season 3, who's about to become a much bigger part of the story than that one Stormcloud farce episode ever suggested she would. Season 5 is a strange, quiet stretch to talk about, honestly, because on its own terms it isn't especially dramatic. It's the season where Mordecai and CJ officially become a couple, first in an episode called Playdate, and then, a little later, they have what the show frames as their first real date together, in an episode generally referred to as Real Date, which ends, sweetly and without much fuss, in a kiss. There isn't a lot of turbulence in how this gets presented on screen. It plays warm, a little goofy, very much in the register of Season 3's original CJ material, whimsical and affectionate rather than heavy. But I want to pause on the timing here, because it's the first place in this whole story where I think a purely interpretive reading, one the series never states outright and one you're free to disagree with, starts to feel worth raising out loud. Mordecai spends most of Season 4 building toward a future with Margaret, gets his heart broken cleanly and sympathetically at the end of it, and then, without a tremendous amount of on-screen processing in between, is back in a new relationship within the run of the very next season. Regular show doesn't dwell on this transition, as a wound that needs tending. It just moves forward, the way episodic television often does, treating the CJ relationship as its own fresh, self-contained story, rather than explicitly framing it as Mordecai working through unresolved grief. Some fans, over the years, have read that quickness as exactly that though. A rebound dressed up as a new romance. A guy filling the space Margaret left, rather than actually healing from losing her. I want to be clear that this is a reading, not something the series confirms anywhere. Mordecai never says anything to that effect, and CJ is never treated on screen as a consolation prize. But it's a reading a meaningful number of viewers have arrived at independently, and it's worth having on the table now, because it's going to matter a great deal for how you interpret his behavior later, specifically around how willing he turns out to be to let this relationship go once an old flame re-enters the picture. What's not really in dispute is that Season 5, considered purely as a season of television, is the point where the broader fan conversation about this show starts to include the word decline for the first time, even if that conversation is actually split rather than unanimous. Some viewers at the time found the season formulaic, a sense that certain rhythms, certain types of workplace disaster, certain shapes of romantic subplot were starting to repeat themselves without quite the same spark they had a couple of years earlier. Other viewers pushed back hard on that read and would tell you Season 5 is still operating near regular show's creative peak, just with slightly less novelty attached because the format itself was no longer new. Both of those camps existed at the time, and honestly, both still exist now, which tells you this is truly a matter of fan opinion rather than something you can settle definitively either way. Behind the scenes, this is also roughly the point where the production team that had shepherded the show through its strongest, most acclaimed years starts to change. Kat Morris, one of the co-supervising producers working alongside creator J.G. Quintel, departed after Season 4 to go work on Steven Universe, a show that would go on to have its own significant cultural footprint. That's not a dramatic, headline-grabbing departure in the way a lead voice actor leaving might be. But creative teams on animated shows are deeply collaborative in a way that's easy to underestimate from the outside, and losing a co-supervising producer means losing someone who'd had a direct hand in shaping tone, pacing, and character voice across the series' most celebrated seasons. It's not the whole story of why things start to shift, not by itself, but it's a real, documented piece of the puzzle, and it's the first domino in a run of departures we're going to keep tracking as we move forward. Because by the time we get to Season 6, the turnover becomes impossible to treat as incidental. There's one more piece of Season 5 worth mentioning honestly, even though it isn't strictly about Mordecai, because it becomes relevant to the wider world of this show a little further down the road. This is the season that introduces Rigby's parents, Sherm and Barbara, in a Thanksgiving special, giving Rigby a family life the series hadn't previously bothered establishing in any detail. It's a small addition in the moment, mostly played for its own self-contained warmth and comedy, but Sherm in particular resurfaces later, in the feature-length movie that eventually gets made out of this world. And it's a good small example of how this show tends to plant details years before it has any specific plan for what to do with them. The same way it planted Mordecai's interest in painting all the way back near the beginning, and didn't really cash that in until the very last episode it ever aired. Taken as a whole, Season 5 plays like a held breath. The relationship with CJ is sweet on its own terms, even if you're inclined, as some fans are, to read a little unprocessed grief underneath it. Regular show's format is still working, even if it's working with slightly less surprise than it used to. And off-screen, the room that made regular show's most celebrated years is starting to turn over. None of this alone would ruin a character. It's the kind of ordinary mid-run turbulence almost every long-running show goes through. But it's the setup, in every sense, for what happens next. Because Season 6 is where all three of these threads, the unresolved question of whether Mordecai ever actually dealt with Margaret, the fan sense that something intangible was shifting, and the very real, very documented turnover in who was actually running this show day to day, all collide at once. Let's deal with the off-screen facts first, because I think they matter more here than in any other stretch of this show's run, and they give us something firmer to stand on than just vibes and fan sentiment. J.G. Quintel never stopped being the creator, the executive producer, the guiding hand of regular show, from the first episode to the last. That much never changed. But directly underneath him, for the show's first 5 seasons, sat 2 co-supervising producers, doing a huge amount of the actual day-to-day creative work, translating Quintel's sensibility into scripts and boards and finished episodes. We already talked about Kat Morris leaving after season 4. The second one, Mike Roth, departs after season 5. And starting with season 6, a writer and director named Sean Sellis becomes the sole supervising producer, the only person now holding that specific role that two people had shared for the entirety of the series' most acclaimed run. I don't want to overstate what that single fact proves on its own, because plenty of shows survive a change like this without any noticeable shift in quality or tone at all. And plenty of viewers watching season 6 in real time wouldn't have known or cared who held which producer title. But it's a real, documented, citable change in exactly who was steering the room during the exact season fans most consistently point to when they talk about this character souring, and that's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as coincidence. A writer's room with two experienced co-supervising producers checking each other, pushing back on each other, balancing each other's instincts, is simply a different creative environment than a room with one person holding that authority alone. Neither structure is inherently better, but they're different, and season 6 is where that difference starts, whatever its actual cause, to show up on screen and how this character gets handled. There's a second piece of real-world context worth laying on the table here too. Quintel has spoken publicly about Cartoon Network telling the crew, over its run, to tone down some of its edgier, more adult-coded humor as the early episodes kept bumping up against the limits of their rating, things like innuendo and the series' fairly loose relationship with adult vices in those first couple of years. That's a documented note from the network, not a rumor. And it's a different kind of pressure than the producer turnover we just talked about. It's not about who's in the room. It's about what the room is allowed to put on screen. I'll be honest that this particular pressure maps less cleanly onto Mordecai's specific character writing than the producer change does. It's more about content edginess broadly than about how any one character's romantic arc gets handled. But it's part of the same larger picture of a show whose creative constraints were shifting underneath it in this exact stretch of years. And it's good to keep in mind as we walk through what actually happens on screen this season. Season 6 opens with Maxon and Relaxin, in which Mordecai brings CJ home to meet his parents. A fairly ordinary rite of passage for the relationship, and a sign, on its face, that things between them are progressing normally, seriously even. It's a domestic, comfortable episode, and if you only watch the premiere, you'd have no particular reason to expect the season was about to become the one fans argue about most. Then comes Merry Christmas Mordecai, and this is where the first real crack appears. Margaret comes back into the picture for the holidays, and in a moment of nostalgic reminiscing with Mordecai, the two of them end up kissing, almost by accident, caught up in the memory of what they used to have, rather than any clear decision either of them makes in the moment. CJ sees it happen. She's devastated, and she leaves. It's a hard scene to watch, and it's the first time in this whole story that Mordecai's unresolved feelings for Margaret directly and visibly wound the person he's currently supposed to be building a life with, rather than just existing somewhere in the back of his own head. Up to this point, you could argue Mordecai's romantic entanglements were messy but essentially victimless. Misunderstandings sorted out, breakups nobody's fault, feelings kept mostly private. Merry Christmas Mordecai is the moment that stops being true. There's now a real person on screen, hurt, in real time, by his failure to have settled something inside himself before he let another person build a relationship with him. And then, at the very end of the season, comes Dumped at the Altar. And I think it's worth walking through this one slowly and completely. Because more than any other single episode across this entire 8-year run, this is the one fans keep coming back to when they want to point at exactly where this character went wrong. The setup is Muscle Man and Starla's wedding, a happy occasion for two side characters who'd been building toward this for a long time. Mordecai, in the middle of the ceremony, ends up reading aloud from a letter about honesty, something that was clearly meant to prompt some kind of private reflection, and instead, it prompts him to hijack the actual wedding with an impromptu speech in front of the entire assembled wedding party about not knowing who his own soulmate is. He is, in this moment, trying to break up with CJ at her own friend's wedding, in front of everyone. And here's the detail that I think does more work than anything else in this whole episode to explain why it's remembered the way it is. He doesn't even look at her while he says it. He doesn't point to her, doesn't address her directly, doesn't do the one basic thing that might have made this feel like an honest, if badly timed, moment of vulnerability. rather than a public spectacle he's making entirely about his own confusion, while the person it's actually about sits there absorbing it secondhand, the same way everyone else in the room is. CJ is devastated. She takes off the charm bracelet he'd given her, a small object that had carried real emotional weight across the relationship, hands it back to him, and runs out of the wedding in tears. Regular Show does eventually walk this back slightly. They quietly agree afterward to take a break rather than a clean, final breakup. But according to the people who actually made the series, that break is effectively the end. CJ cuts ties with the entire friend group after this. She appears again exactly twice more across the rest of the series, both times in silent cameos, no dialogue, no closure, no reconciliation. As far as Regular Show is concerned, whatever happened at that wedding is the last real thing that ever happens between these two people. This is the episode. If you go looking through fan discussion of this show, forum threads with titles calling this Mordecai's lowest moment, entries on pages built specifically to track a show's most divisive or infuriating scenes, even standalone posts elsewhere online literally titled after this episode as the worst thing the show ever did to this character. This is consistently, overwhelmingly, the single moment people cite. And I think it pays to be honest about why it lands so much harder than anything we've covered so far tonight. Because it's not simply that a relationship ends. Relationships end all the time in fiction, including in this show, including to this exact character, without anyone walking away thinking less of him for it. It's the manner of it. Compare this directly to Stake Me Amadeus, which we spent real time on earlier. In that finale, the breakup wasn't Mordecai's fault at all. It was circumstance. It was Margaret's own future pulling her somewhere he couldn't follow, and the series let him grieve that honestly, privately, sympathetically. Here, the breakup is entirely his doing, born out of his own unresolved feelings for someone else, and instead of having the basic decency to have that conversation with CJ privately, the way an adult who respected her would, he stages it as a public spectacle at somebody else's wedding, hijacking a friend's happiest day to work through his own confusion out loud, and doesn't even extend her the courtesy of looking at her while he does it. Where Season 4's breakup asked you to feel for him, Season 6's finale asks you, whether the writers fully intended this or not, to feel for her, and to find him, at least in this one specific moment, hard to root for. This is honestly the part of this whole story that gets me the most, and I say that as someone who came into this video wanting to be fair to a character. Plenty of people online seem to enjoy tearing apart. It's not that Mordecai has a flaw here. He's had this exact flaw, avoiding hard conversations, letting confusion calcify into cowardice, since Season 3. It's that Regular Show, for the first time, stops treating that flaw as something the story happens around, and starts treating it as something the story is actively uncomfortably about, and then declines to give the person on the receiving end of it anything resembling a fair accounting. CJ doesn't get a scene where Mordecai apologizes properly. She doesn't get closure. She gets a public humiliation, and then she gets erased from the series almost entirely, and Mordecai gets to walk away from a mess he created with barely any on-screen reckoning attached to it at all. There's a name fans and fan wiki communities have put to this pattern, one worth mentioning honestly even though it comes from second-hand paraphrased sourcing rather than something official, so take it as fan terminology rather than settled fact. It's sometimes described using the word flanderization, the idea of a character's traits, especially their flaws, getting exaggerated and simplified over time until they crowd out everything else that used to define them. The specific version of this argument applied to Mordecai goes something like this. He used to be the more mature, more level-headed one in his friendship with Rigby. By Season 6, per this reading, he's become someone even Rigby, the professional avoider of all responsibility, looks more emotionally reliable than. Whether or not you'd phrase it exactly that way yourself, I think the underlying observation holds up reasonably well against what we've just walked through. The steadiness that defined him in Season 1 has curdled, by this point, into something closer to romantic paralysis, dressed up as sincerity. There's also a broader debate that circulates on fan pages dedicated to tracking divisive or contested character reads, over whether Mordecai by this point in the show has become what's sometimes called unintentionally unsympathetic, meaning the writers likely still intend for you to root for him, but the accumulated weight of his romantic indecision, his self-pity whenever his own choices blow up in his face, and his habit of sidelining his actual best friend in favor of whichever romance is currently occupying his attention, adds up to something the intended sympathy doesn't quite survive contact with. I'll say plainly that this is fan reading, not something the series or its creators have ever stated as an intended effect, but it's a widely enough held reading that it's worth taking seriously as part of the honest record of how this character was actually received. And here's a wrinkle that I think makes this whole chapter of the story more interesting rather than less, one that's worth taking seriously before we move any further. Professional television critics did not, broadly, agree that Season 6 represented some kind of quality collapse. The AV Club, reviewing this season at the time, gave it one of its strongest grades of the series' entire run, praising exactly the kind of complex, emotionally rich storytelling that produced an episode like Dumped at the Altar in the first place. From a pure craft standpoint, a professional critic watching this season saw a show taking bigger emotional risks and mostly landing them. From a character sympathy standpoint, a huge swath of the fandom saw a beloved lead behaving worse than he ever had before. Those two readings aren't actually contradictory, and I think that tension, more than any single bad decision by any single writer, is the real story of what happens to Mordecai in Season 6. Regular show got better, in a lot of technical, structural, storytelling senses, at making you feel things. And one of the things it made a lot of longtime viewers feel, whether or not that was fully the intention, was that they no longer entirely liked its main character. That's a strange, uncomfortable place for a family cartoon to land its lead character in its 6th year on the air. And I want to remember, as we move into what comes next, that regular show never really steps back to address it directly. There's no Season 7 episode that has Mordecai sit down and reckon honestly with what he did at that wedding. CJ doesn't get to tell him how she felt about it. The series simply moves forward, the way it always has, treating this as one more chapter closed rather than a wound that needs tending. And that decision, to let this land and then just keep walking, is arguably as important to how fans remember this character as the wedding scene itself. Season 7 is a strange, uneven year to talk about, because on paper it's the season where the whole show is visibly struggling for its life in the ratings. And it's also the season that ends up giving Mordecai his single most graceful, most mature exit from anything across this entire romantic saga. Those two facts sit right next to each other, and I think they complicate any version of this story that wants to be a clean, straight line from good writing to bad writing. This isn't a straight line. It never really is. Let's take the harder, plainer fact first. Regular show's broadcast audience, which had already been sliding since its Season 4 peak, drops sharply this year, down into a range under 1 million viewers for a lot of individual episodes. A serious fall from the 3 million plus the show was pulling during Exit 9B only a few years earlier. That's not a fan opinion. That's a straightforward viewership number, and it's the clearest, least debatable evidence in this entire story that something about regular show's broader audience was shrinking during exactly the stretch fans point to as its creative low point. Whether the writing caused the ratings drop, or the ratings drop is just what naturally happens to any long-running cartoon this many years into its life regardless of quality, is a truly open question, and honestly, probably some mix of both. But the number itself is real, and it's worth having on the table plainly, without dressing it up as more conclusive than it is. Behind the scenes, this is also the season where Calvin Wong, a longtime storyboard artist and director on the series, departs, following an episode called Win That Prize, continuing the exact pattern of experienced creative staff cycling out that we've been tracking since Kat Morris left after Season 4. By this point in the series' run, the room that built its most beloved seasons has turned over almost completely. Quintel is still there, still the guiding creative voice behind the whole thing. But the people executing that vision day to day are, by Season 7, a substantially different group of people than the ones who wrote Yes Dude Yes or Stake Me Amadeus. And according to Quintel himself, speaking afterward in an industry trade interview, this is roughly the point where the creative team learned that whatever renewal came next was going to be a smaller one, a reduced order rather than a continuation at regular show's previous scale. Rather than simply riding that reduced order out and letting it wind down on somebody else's terms, Quintel has said he made the decision to use the show's final stretch to end it deliberately, on his own terms, and to finally attempt something the format hadn't really allowed before, a fully serialized, arc-driven story rather than a season of mostly standalone episodic gags. That's a actually different kind of explanation for a tonal shift than anything we've discussed so far in this video. It's not network-mandated content softening, and it's not simply a rotating cast of writers drifting away from what made the series work. It's a specific, documented creative choice, made in response to a specific, documented business reality, to spend the series' remaining runway on something bigger and riskier than another season of business as usual. The episode Quintel himself has pointed to as the actual hinge point for this shift is Rigby's graduation day special, which he's described as the moment the show found its footing for the more dramatic, arc-driven storytelling that would define its final stretch. It helps to name this episode clearly, because it's effectively the bridge between everything we've covered tonight and the very different kind of show Season 8 turns out to be. Up to this point, whatever your opinion of how Mordecai's romantic writing had been handled, Regular Show was still, fundamentally, an episodic gag comedy with ongoing relationship subplots layered on top. After this special, it starts becoming something else entirely, a show building toward one continuous story rather than 40 individual ones. But before any of that fully kicks in, Season 7 gives us Just Friends, and I think this episode deserves a lot more credit in this conversation than it usually gets, precisely because of how directly it contrasts with what happened at that wedding the season before. A fortune-teller character gives Mordecai and Margaret a glimpse of a possible future together, the kind of narrative device this show has used before to let characters see a version of their own life from the outside. And rather than chasing that vision, rather than letting it reopen old wounds or spiral into another round of romantic confusion, the two of them talk it through honestly and mutually decide, calmly, as adults, to just be friends. According to the people who made the series, this decision sticks. It's not walked back later, not undone by another Christmas reunion or another accidental kiss. Margaret's chapter, as far as this specific romantic story goes, closes here, cleanly, with both people's dignity intact. I think it's worth pausing on how different this feels from Dumped at the Altar, because the contrast tells you something important about what this show was actually capable of, even this late in its run, even with a substantially turned-over writing staff, even in the middle of a ratings freefall. Just Friends has every ingredient that made the wedding disaster so painful to watch. There's a relationship with real, years-long history. There's an external prompt, in this case, a supernatural vision rather than a letter about honesty, forcing a conversation that might otherwise have been avoided. There's a decision to end something rather than let it continue. And this time, Regular Show has both people sit down, talk honestly, and part ways with mutual respect. Rather than staging a public spectacle where one person's confusion humiliates the other in front of a whole room of witnesses. Nobody runs out crying, nobody gets erased from the narrative afterward as collateral damage. It's handled, frankly, about as well as this kind of storyline can be handled. What that tells me, and again, this is my own reading of it rather than anything its creators confirmed, is that the decline we've been tracking across Season 5 and especially Season 6 isn't some permanent, one-way slide that Season 7 simply continues. It's uneven. The same writing team, working under the same reduced ratings, the same staff turnover, the same pressure to wrap the show up, produced both a really graceful ending for one relationship and, one season earlier, a properly ugly ending for another. If this were simply a story about a show getting worse at handling romance as it aged, Just Friends shouldn't exist in the form it exists in. Its existence complicates the theory, in a way I think is actually more interesting than a version of this story where everything just gets steadily worse in a straight line. It suggests the problem was never fully a matter of the writers losing the ability to write this material well. It's more that the series, at least once, in Dumped at the Altar, specifically chose a version of the story that served spectacle and drama over basic decency toward a supporting character, and then, a season later, chose a version that served exactly the opposite instinct. There's something almost frustrating about that, honestly, if you're inclined to be protective of how this character gets remembered. It would almost be easier to defend Mordecai and defend the writers if the series simply couldn't write a graceful breakup by this point in its run. Instead, Just Friends proves they absolutely could, only a handful of episodes after choosing not to. That inconsistency, more than a flat, uninterrupted decline, is probably the most honest way to describe what happens to this character across these middle seasons. It's not that Regular Show forgot how to be careful with him and the people around him. It's that it wasn't careful consistently, and the one time it wasn't, at that wedding, happened to be the moment that stuck hardest in the fandom's memory, for reasons that, having walked through both episodes now, are pretty easy to understand. By the end of Season 7, then, both of regular show's major love triangle threads are closed. Margaret is gone, amicably, on good terms. A chapter that ends the way a lot of viewers probably wish the CJ story had ended too. CJ is gone as well, but on far worse terms. Cut off from the entire friend group, reduced to 2 silent cameos, her side of the story never given a proper hearing. And the series itself is about to change shape entirely, trading its episodic gag format for a continuous, serialized story that's going to carry Mordecai somewhere neither triangle ever suggested he was headed. Season 8 is where regular show stops being the show it spent 7 years being, and it does this on purpose, deliberately, as the direct result of the choice Quintel made after learning the next renewal would be smaller. Gone, almost entirely, is the format of a self-contained workplace disaster resolving itself within 22 minutes. In its place is one long, continuous story, set largely off the park grounds entirely and out into outer space, building steadily toward a confrontation between Pops, the strange, gentle park owner's son we met all the way back in Season 1, and his cosmic evil twin, a figure regular show calls Anti-Pops. This isn't a subplot woven through a normal season anymore. By this point, it's essentially the whole show. Fan reaction to this shift, at the time and in retrospect, is authentically split, and I would rather be honest about that than pretend everyone hated it or everyone loved it. A meaningful number of longtime viewers found the space setting limiting, a departure from the thing that made the series distinctive in the first place, which was never really outer space battles for their own sake, but the specific comic tension of mundane groundskeeping tasks spiraling into cosmic stakes. Once the series commits fully to the cosmic stakes as its entire premise for a whole season, some of that original tension, the gap between the mundane and the mythic that we talked about all the way back at the start of this video, simply isn't available anymore, because there's no mundane task left to escalate away from. It's cosmic stakes from the opening scene of most episodes onward. At the same time, a large number of viewers, including some who'd soured on regular show a season or 2 earlier, came back around specifically for these final episodes. And it's honestly common, even among people with mixed feelings about Season 8 as a whole, to hear that the actual finale itself, when it finally arrives, mostly sticks the landing. Behind the scenes, this final stretch also saw one more piece of creative turnover worth naming, since it fits the pattern we've been tracking since Kat Morris left after Season 4. Ben Adams, who had been the show's main character designer, was replaced during the production of the final season, back in the spring of 2016, by Casey Hermanson. Character design isn't the same thing as writing, obviously, and there's no evidence this specific change had any direct bearing on how Mordecai's dialogue or story beats were handled. But it's one more data point in a larger, very real picture. By the time regular show reaches its final season, essentially none of the key creative roles below Quintel himself, not the co-supervising producer position, not several of the storyboard directors, not even the character designer, are held by the same people who built regular show's most celebrated early seasons. Here's something worth noticing about Mordecai specifically in this final stretch, and I think it's one of the more interesting, under-discussed threads in this whole story. For the first time in years, his personal arc isn't primarily a romantic one. There's no active love triangle running through Season 8. Margaret is gone, settled, amicable. CJ is gone, cut off, unresolved but no longer an active plot thread. What's left, once the show strips away the romantic subplot machinery that had carried so much of the last several seasons, is something closer to what the series actually started with: a friendship, under pressure, facing something enormous, with Mordecai and Rigby working through it side by side, rather than Mordecai working through it alone in his own head, while everyone around him gets hurt by his indecision. I think there's a real argument, and I'll say clearly that this is interpretation and not a claim the series makes about itself, that Season 8 ends up making Mordecai more likable again, almost by omission rather than by growth. It's not that the writers sit him down and walk him through everything from that wedding 2 years earlier. They never do that. We already established that the story never circles back. It's that the plot simply stops asking him to be the source of the mess. Once the story's central problem becomes an interdimensional cosmic threat, rather than his own inability to be honest with the people who love him, the exact same personality traits that curdled so badly in Season 6, the tendency to react rather than reflect, the loyalty to Rigby above almost anything else, even a certain amount of impulsiveness, suddenly read as assets rather than liabilities. He's not being asked to have a difficult conversation with anyone. He's being asked to help save the universe alongside his best friend, and that's a task his established personality was always well suited for, going all the way back to a magic keyboard and a trip to the moon in the very first episode. That's an interesting, if slightly backhanded, way for a character's writing to recover. Not through deliberate repair, but through the story simply changing what it needs from him. And it raises a question worth carrying into the actual finale, because the finale is where the series finally has to decide, after 8 years, what kind of ending this specific character actually deserves, and whether that ending is going to feel like a genuine resolution to everything we've walked through tonight, or simply a way of moving past it without ever quite addressing it directly. The series finale, a 3-part television special called A Regular Epic Final Battle, aired on January 16, 2017, running a little over half an hour altogether, and it closes out Regular Show by finally cashing in a piece of lore that had been sitting quietly in the background for years. Pops, the gentle, oddly formal park owner's son who's been part of this cast since the very beginning, turns out to be something far stranger than anyone watching those first couple of seasons could reasonably have guessed. He's an otherworldly being from a distant planet, the series' designated embodiment of pure good in a much larger cosmic order, and he has an evil counterpart, a twin from that same cosmology, built to represent the opposite of everything he stands for. That counterpart, Anti-Pops, is the villain of the finale, and the two of them end up in a direct confrontation on Pops' home planet, a battle that early on just resets time over and over, rather than actually resolving anything. Regular Show playing with the idea that brute force alone can't settle this particular fight. Eventually, Anti-Pops kills essentially the entire supporting cast in one stroke, everyone except Mordecai, Rigby, Pops himself, and Anti-Pops. Mordecai and Rigby manage to position themselves to reset the timeline one more time while keeping their memories intact, which matters, because it means whatever happens next is something they'll actually carry forward rather than simply forgetting. And the way Pops actually ends the cycle, in the end, isn't through a bigger punch or a cleverer trick. It's through an embrace. He wraps his arms around his own evil twin and flies directly into the sun, sacrificing himself completely. And that sacrifice is what breaks the cycle for good and restores everyone the battle had erased. It's a quiet, strange, legitimately moving way to end a fight that had spent its first 2 parts escalating into bigger and bigger spectacle. And it's the one true permanent death across this entire show's run, a character choosing to end his own life to save everyone else's, played with a surprising amount of tenderness for a cartoon that spent most of its existence making jokes about lawn care. And then the finale does something this show had never really done before across its whole run. It jumps forward roughly 25 years, all at once, to show us who everyone actually became. Mordecai, in that jump, is a successful painter. It pays to stop on that for a second, because it's a direct payoff of a thread the show planted all the way back near the very beginning and mostly left alone for years at a time. His quiet, half-embarrassed interest in art, something he almost never talked about openly in front of anyone during Regular Show's chaotic middle stretch. Giving him this specific ending, an actual career doing the thing he always wanted to do but was too insecure to pursue seriously, is one of the more satisfying long-game character payoffs this show manages anywhere, and I think it deserves real credit as a piece of writing, independent of everything we've spent the last several chapters being critical of. He's also, in this jump, married to a character named Steph, an anthropomorphic bat introduced only in this finale montage, and the two of them have 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. The finale brings us back to the park roughly 25 years on, where Mordecai and Rigby, both now in their 50s, reunite with old friends and play arcade games together the way they used to as young groundskeepers, a small, warm, deliberately nostalgic image to close the whole series on. Rigby, in this same jump, ends up with Eileen, a co-worker who'd been part of the supporting cast for years. High Five Ghost becomes a DJ. Muscle Man has a family with Starla, the same woman whose wedding, several seasons earlier, Mordecai had hijacked with his own romantic confusion. Margaret appears too, now working as a traveling newswoman, and the finale is careful to show that she stayed in touch with the group over the years, present, at peace, on good terms with everyone including Mordecai, the way just friends had promised she would be. Benson and Skips are still at the park, long-term, with Skips apparently unaged, still doing whatever it is an immortal groundskeeper does, with several more decades on the clock. CJ is not there. Nobody in the reunion mentions her. 25 years pass, and whatever door, dumped at the altar, closed all those seasons earlier, simply stays closed, permanently, without a single line of dialogue walking it back or softening it. That's a plainly bold choice for a finale to make, in its own way, refusing to manufacture a last-minute reconciliation just to tie every loose end into a bow. It lets the fallout from that ceremony actually mean something, all the way to the end. Whether that reads as honest storytelling or as one more example of the series letting Mordecai off the hook, without ever making him face what he did to her directly, probably depends on which way you were already leaning coming into this finale. According to comments Regular Show's creative team gave after this episode aired, the decision to pair Mordecai with someone entirely new, rather than circling back to either Margaret or CJ, was deliberate. As they put it, they felt like the Margaret and CJ story was complete, and both of those characters were already on their own path, while Mordecai had moved on in his own life, finally left the park to pursue art, and they thought it would be interesting if he met someone new while doing that. That's about as clear a statement of creative intent as you're going to find anywhere in this entire story, and it's worth taking at face value. The series wasn't trying to deliver a payoff to either existing triangle. It was trying to tell you that Mordecai's real arc, the thing his whole story had actually been building toward underneath all the romantic noise, was leaving the park and becoming who he'd always quietly wanted to be, and that a new relationship was simply part of what that new life looked like, rather than the point of the ending itself. Not everyone bought that framing, and the other side of this deserves a fair hearing too. A recurring complaint you'll find among fans who track this show's tropes and story patterns is that after years of investment in two specific, well-developed relationships, having Mordecai end up with neither Margaret nor CJ, but instead with a character the audience meets for the first time in the closing minutes of the very last episode, feels like a bit of a shrug. Years of romantic drama, the argument goes, and none of it actually mattered to where he ends up. It's sometimes filed, in fan trope discussions, under the idea of a storyline amounting to nothing. All that build-up spent on relationships that ultimately connect to nothing about how the story actually resolves. I understand that read, and I don't think it's unreasonable, but I'd push back on it slightly, and I'll say plainly that this is my own interpretation rather than a settled fact. I don't think the love triangle was ever really the point of Mordecai's arc, even though it consumed most of the show's attention for years at a stretch, and even though it's the reason most of tonight's video exists in the first place. I think, looking at the whole 8 years together, his actual arc was always about whether he could stop waiting for his life to happen to him, whether that meant waiting for Margaret to notice him, waiting for CJ to forgive an unforgivable public breakup, or simply waiting, quietly, for years, to take his own art seriously enough to do something with it. Ending Regular Show with him finally, actually doing that, leaving, painting, building an entirely new life on his own initiative, rather than reacting to whoever happened to be in front of him, feels, to me, like a more honest resolution to 8 years of a character who mostly moved through life by reacting rather than choosing. It doesn't erase what he did at that reception. It doesn't retroactively make Season 6 less uncomfortable to watch, but it does suggest that whatever the writers thought this character's story was actually about, by the very end, it was never really about which woman he ended up with at all. That's a generous reading, and you're free to disagree with it. What isn't really up for debate is the plainer, harder question underneath all of this. The one that actually determines whether the ruined Mordecai idea holds up as a fair description of what happened here, or whether it's an overstatement built on one especially memorable bad episode. And answering that honestly means stepping back from any single season and looking at the whole picture at once. The ratings, the review scores, the fan discourse, and the professional critical response, side by side. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers are at least a fixed point to argue from, even if what they mean is still up for interpretation. Regular show's live broadcast audience peaks in Season 4, with Exit 9B pulling in somewhere north of 3 million viewers, and from that point forward, the trend across Seasons 5, 6, and especially 7 is a fairly steady decline, bottoming out with a lot of Season 7 episodes drawing well under 1 million viewers, before a modest rebound around the hype of the finale itself in Season 8. Taken in isolation, that's a clearly clean, citable, non-opinion-based downward trend, and it lines up almost perfectly with the years fans point to when they talk about the series souring, which is exactly why it's tempting to treat it as proof of the fan narrative. But here's where it gets more complicated, and where I think a fair accounting has to slow down rather than just nod along with the tidy version of this story. Audience rating aggregates for regular show, the kind built from viewer scores left after the fact, rather than live broadcast numbers, do not show anywhere near as clean a decline. Season 1 sits at roughly 97% positive by these audience aggregates, and Season 8, the space arc, the serialized finale, the season most closely associated with everything we've spent the last stretch of this video discussing, sits right up in that same very high range, well into the 90s. That's barely any movement at all across 8 years and 40-some-odd episodes of dramatic tonal and structural change. If you were relying purely on how audiences rated each season after actually watching it, in full, you would come away thinking this show barely dipped in quality at any point in its run, which sits pretty uncomfortably next to a broadcast viewership chart that looks like a ski slope. I'll also flag something directly, because getting this wrong would be exactly the kind of overconfident, unverified claim this channel has been burned by before. You may have seen a specific number floating around online. A claim that Season 1 of this show scored something like 9.3 out of 10 on a major review aggregator, while Season 8 scored something like 3.2, a dramatic, headline-ready collapse in quality. That specific comparison could not be verified anywhere in the actual review data for this show. It appears to be either a misremembering of some other show entirely, or simply an invented number that sounds plausible and gets repeated because it confirms what people already believe. Treat it as false, or at minimum entirely unconfirmed, and be suspicious of anyone citing it as settled fact, because it isn't one. So you end up with two for real different pictures depending on which numbers you trust. Broadcast viewership says the show was hemorrhaging its audience for years. Audience review aggregates say the series barely moved in perceived quality at all. Both of those things are real, documented, and simultaneously true. And I think the honest explanation for how they coexist is that broadcast viewership, especially for a kids' network cartoon in the 2010s, was being shaped by a whole set of forces that have very little to do with any individual episode's quality. The broader collapse of appointment television viewing as streaming and on-demand habits took over. Shifting time slots, competition from other programming, kids simply aging out of the demographic over an 8-year run. A show can lose the bulk of its live audience for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the writing got worse, and the audience rating data here suggests that's at least part of what's actually going on, rather than a straightforward story of declining quality driving away viewers one bad episode at a time. Then there's the professional critical response, which complicates the fan narrative even further, and which I think is the single most important piece of context missing from most casual conversations about this show's later years. When AV Club, a respected outlet for serious television criticism, reviewed Season 6, the exact season that gave us Dumped at the Altar, the exact season most consistently cited by fans as the point of no return for Mordecai, they gave it one of the strongest grades of the series' entire run, explicitly praising the shift toward more complex, more emotionally rich storytelling. When the finale eventually aired, critical response praised the turn towards serialized, surreal, almost apocalyptic storytelling as an earned, satisfying way to close out the series, not a desperate scramble by a show that had lost its way. I think I want to be really honest about what that means for how we should frame everything we've discussed tonight. The ruined Mordecai thesis. The idea that this character specifically got progressively worse written across regular show's back half is real. It's not manufactured out of nothing. It's a genuine, widespread, well-documented current running through fan forums, trope-tracking pages, and long-running online debates about this show. But it is fan discourse. It is not something professional critics, watching the same episodes with the same access to the same context, broadly agreed with. If anything, the exact seasons fans cite as the character's low point are, by professional critical consensus, some of the series' most acclaimed for craft and emotional ambition. Those two things aren't contradictory so much as they're measuring completely different things. A critic evaluating storytelling craft can watch Dumped at the Altar and admire how effectively it lands its gut punch, how well constructed the scene is, how in real terms it earns the emotional reaction it's going for, while a longtime fan watching the exact same scene experiences it purely through the lens of a character they've spent years rooting for, suddenly becoming someone they don't like very much anymore. Both reactions can be completely valid readings of the exact same 22 minutes of television. This is also a good place to properly weigh a complaint we've touched on a couple of times without fully unpacking. The argument, found across various fan discussion spaces, that Mordecai rarely grows through actual reflection across this show's run, and instead mostly changes only when forced to by circumstances that are, quite literally, life-threatening. Fans making this argument tend to point to episodes like Meteor Moves, where a genuine external crisis forces an emotional moment that wouldn't have happened through ordinary conversation, or Dodge This, cited in the same breath as an example of growth arriving only under extreme, high-stakes pressure, rather than through a character actually working through his own feelings and choosing to change. I think this is an unmistakably fair observation about how this show tends to structure its emotional beats generally, not just for Mordecai. Regular Show, across its whole run, mostly earns its feelings through escalation and spectacle, rather than through quiet, unforced character work, because that's simply the kind of show it is. A show that turns a missed shift into a moon landing, rather than one that sits two guys down for a long, thoughtful conversation about their feelings. Applied specifically to Mordecai's romantic arc, though, that same tendency has a real cost, because it means his lowest moment, the wedding, and arguably his highest moment, deciding at the very end to actually leave the park and paint, both arrive through external pressure and plot mechanics, rather than through him independently reckoning with who he wants to be. Whether you read that as a flaw specific to how this character was handled, or as an honest description of how this entire show tends to handle everyone's emotional growth, probably depends on how much patience you have for the show's overall storytelling instincts by this point. Put all of this together, and I think the fairest, most honest verdict tonight can land on is something like this. Mordecai's writing does shift across these 8 seasons, in ways you can point to on screen, not just in vibes. The series does ask him to carry more romantic dysfunction as real drama rather than as comedic misunderstanding, and it does, in one specific finale, let him behave about as badly towards someone he supposedly loved as this show ever lets any of its core characters behave toward anyone. That's real. It happened. It's on screen, and it's fair for it to be the single moment fans point to most often when they talk about this character souring. But treating that as proof Regular Show as a whole collapsed in quality, or that professional consensus somehow agreed the writing got worse across the board, overstates the case in a way the actual review data and actual critical response simply don't support. The truth sitting underneath the loud, understandably passionate fan discourse is messier and, honestly, more interesting than either the ruined narrative or a simple defense of the later seasons would suggest on its own. There's another piece of this whole picture worth bringing in before we start pulling back to close things out. And it's unusual for a video like this, because it involves material that's still actively airing as we're putting this together. In June of 2024, a revival series was greenlit, and it's real, official, produced by the same network, not fan content or some independent tribute project. It's called Regular Show, The Lost Tapes. It began airing in May of 2026 on Cartoon Network, with a slightly later streaming debut in June on HBO Max and Hulu. And it's created and showrun by Quintel himself, with nearly the entire original voice cast returning, including Mark Hamill reprising his role as Skips. What makes this revival structurally unusual, and honestly kind of clever, is its framing device. Pops, established in the original finale as having sacrificed himself permanently to end the fight with Anti-Pops, is shown here in some form of afterlife, and the premise is that he's missing a memory, represented as a lost VHS tape, and each episode of this new series fills in one of those missing tapes, slotting an untold adventure somewhere into the original run's timeline between 2010 and 2017. It's not a sequel picking up after the time skip we just spent a whole chapter on. It's more like a set of deleted scenes, presented as new episodes, none of which are meant to have happened after the story we already know the ending to. That's a sincerely respectful way to handle a character's permanent, sacrificial death, letting him still exist as a framing device and an in memoriam presence without cheaply undoing the thing that made his ending matter in the first place. As of when this video is being put together, only a portion of a planned run of somewhere around 3 or 4 dozen episodes has actually aired, so it's worth treating any specific total episode count for this revival as soft and likely to change rather than something fixed, since the thing is still in production. Early critical reception has skewed mixed to negative, for whatever that's worth, and it's in earnest too early in this new series' life to say much with confidence about how it'll ultimately be remembered. What it has already done, though, is correct a piece of this character's backstory that a previous video on this very channel got wrong, and since we're on the subject of getting things right, it helps to set the record straight here, briefly, rather than leaving an old mistake uncorrected. The revival's episode Beginson fills in how Benson actually came to be park manager, and the short version, without spending the whole rest of this video retelling a story that's already had its own dedicated episode on this channel, is this. Benson had been the drummer in a hair metal band, got fired from it after his solo got credited to a drum machine instead of him, and it was only afterward that he was eventually hired on as the park's manager, taking over from a previous manager whose actual name, not a title, not a description, but his literal name, was Talks. That's the corrected version. It wasn't a story about an early morning band practice and Pops discovering him behind a drum kit, and I want to be exact about that now, on the record, since it's exactly the kind of detail this channel has gotten wrong before and shouldn't get wrong again. Setting that correction aside, the broader reason a revival like this exists at all tells you something worth thinking through about where regular show has ended up culturally, nearly a decade after it originally went off the air. This wasn't a short-lived, quickly forgotten cartoon. It's a show a network was still willing to bring back, with its original creator and most of its original cast, a full 9 years after its finale aired, banking on the idea that there was still enough affection and enough of an audience out there for people to want more stories set inside this particular world. That's not a small thing. Plenty of shows from this same era of Cartoon Network's history don't get that kind of treatment. It sits, alongside a small handful of other shows from roughly the same stretch of years, as part of a period where the network was clearly willing to let its animated comedies get stranger, sadder, and more ambitious than the format had typically allowed before. Cartoons that could still deliver a joke about mowing a lawn in one episode, and then without exaggeration, devastate you with a wedding speech gone wrong 2 seasons later. Whatever you think of how any individual character's writing held up across 8 years of that ambition, regular show clearly succeeded at building something people still wanted to spend time in, years and years after the fact. It's worth holding both of those things at once as we head toward the end of tonight's video. A show can be, no question, meaningfully important, can leave enough of a mark that a network brings it back nearly a decade later with its whole cast intact, and can still, within its own run, make some real, honest missteps with how it handled one specific, beloved character's romantic life. Those two facts don't cancel each other out. They just sit next to each other, the way most honest assessments of long-running, ambitious television tend to. There's a piece of this story we haven't spent nearly enough time on yet, and I think it's actually the most important gap in how this whole ruined Mordecai conversation usually gets held. Because most of that conversation, understandably, centers Mordecai, his choices, his growth or lack of it, his redemption or lack of it by the finale. But there's another character sitting at the center of the worst of this, and I don't think we can call this an honest accounting of what happened across these 8 seasons without spending real time on her specifically, on her own terms, rather than only as a supporting detail in someone else's arc. Go back to how CJ is actually introduced, way back in Yes Dude Yes. She's a storm cloud girl, quite literally. Her emotional state made into weather, charming and a little intense from the moment she appears. And that's a clever, distinctive piece of character design. But notice what it also does structurally, from the very start. It ties her characterization directly and almost entirely to her emotional reactions to Mordecai. She's introduced through a dating profile he stumbles onto. Her big early character beat is a jealous storm triggered by his own mistake. Her defining trait, from her very first appearance, is intensity of feeling, specifically feeling about him. Compare that to how Margaret gets introduced and built out over the run of the show. A job, a family we hear about, a specific dream school she's working toward, independent of any relationship, an entire life that exists whether or not Mordecai is anywhere near it. Margaret was always written, even in her earliest appearances, as a person with her own trajectory that a relationship with Mordecai might intersect, but wouldn't define. CJ, by contrast, mostly enters the series already tethered to him, defined by her reactions to him, and I think that difference in how these two characters get built from the ground up quietly sets up everything that happens to CJ later, long before Dumped at the Altar ever airs. Because when that relationship ends, badly, publicly, cruelly, the series doesn't actually give CJ anywhere else to go, narratively speaking, because it never really built her anywhere else to go in the first place. Margaret, once her romantic thread with Mordecai closes in just friends, still has an entire life waiting for her. A career, a sense of self, a reason to keep appearing in the story on her own terms, which is exactly why she's still around in the finale, a full quarter-century later. Present, at peace, a fully realized person, independent of whatever she once was to Mordecai. CJ, once her relationship with Mordecai ends, simply has nothing left for regular show to do with her, because the series never gave her anything beyond that relationship to be defined by. She gets the charm bracelet handed back, the tears, the exit, and then 2 silent, wordless cameos, and that's the entirety of her presence in this world going forward. She doesn't get an equivalent to Margaret's newswoman career. She doesn't get a moment of her own peace, her own growth, her own life continuing on without him. She just stops existing in any narratively meaningful sense, at exactly the moment she stops being useful to Mordecai's story. I think that's worth naming plainly, and I want to be clear this is my own reading of the pattern, not something the series or its creators have stated as intentional. But when you put it next to everything else we've walked through tonight, it complicates the ruined Mordecai framing in an interesting way, because it suggests the real issue running underneath these seasons isn't only that one character's writing got worse. It's that regular show's romantic subplots, across this whole stretch, tended to treat its women as instruments of Mordecai's development, rather than as people with development of their own. And CJ simply drew the short straw of being the instrument that got discarded at its most narratively convenient, most dramatically charged moment, rather than the one that got a graceful, mutual, dignified off-ramp. Margaret's story ending well and CJ's story ending in silence aren't two separate accidents. They're the predictable result of two characters who were built, from their very first appearances years apart, with fundamentally different amounts of narrative independence from the man they were both, for a while, in love with. This doesn't erase or excuse what Mordecai does at that wedding. If anything, I think it sharpens it. It's not just that he humiliates someone he cares about in public. It's that he does it to the one major character in his life. The show never bothered giving an existence outside of him in the first place, which means there's no soft landing waiting for her afterward, no career to retreat into, no dignity restored by a later appearance where she's clearly thriving on her own terms. He breaks something regular show had already, structurally, made fragile long before that wedding ever started. Stepping back even further, I think there's a broader pattern worth naming here, one that goes well beyond this one show and this one character, because it's flat out useful for understanding why this exact kind of "they ruined him" conversation keeps happening around long-running television in general, and why it pays to be a little suspicious of the shape of the argument, even when, as in Mordecai's case, there's real evidence behind it. Episodic television, the kind built around standalone stories resolving within a single episode, is structurally resistant to real character growth, almost by design. If a show needs its premise to keep working season after season, if Mordecai and Rigby need to still be groundskeepers getting into trouble in Season 7 the same way they were in Season 1, then any given episode can only let its characters change so much before that change starts threatening the very format the series depends on. A sitcom, a workplace comedy, a kid's cartoon built on a recurring premise. All of these formats have a kind of built-in gravity, pulling characters back toward their starting point at the end of every episode, because next week's story needs them roughly where they started. That gravity is precisely why the complaint about growth only arriving through external, life-threatening pressure isn't unique to this show or to this character. It's close to a structural inevitability for any long-running, mostly episodic series that still wants its characters to occasionally feel like they're moving forward. Quiet, unforced, internally motivated growth is expensive. Narratively, it takes real time and real restraint to build convincingly, and it's much easier, much cheaper in terms of storytelling real estate, to manufacture a crisis and let the crisis do the emotional work instead. What makes Regular Show a straightforwardly interesting case study, rather than just another example of this general pattern, is that it eventually tried to solve this exact problem directly, on purpose, by blowing up its own format entirely in its final season. The shift to full serialization that we talked about a couple of chapters back wasn't only a response to a smaller renewal order. It was, functionally, an attempt to finally let a character grow across sustained, connected story rather than through 11 minutes of crisis, followed by a hard reset back to the status quo. And honestly, this attempt mostly works, at least for Mordecai specifically. The finale's ending doesn't arrive out of a single episode's life-threatening pressure. It arrives out of a sustained arc that lets him actually leave, actually change his circumstances permanently, actually follow through on something instead of reverting back to groundskeeping once the credits roll. That's a real structural achievement, even if it comes at the tail end of a run that spent most of its life fully committed to the format that makes this kind of growth so hard to earn in the first place. I think that's the most useful lens for understanding the specific complaint fans have leveled at this character over the years. The idea that he's stuck reacting rather than choosing. That his growth only ever shows up under pressure rather than through reflection. It's not really a complaint unique to bad writing on this particular show. It's closer to an honest description of what episodic television structurally does to any character it keeps around long enough. And Regular Show's real distinction, for better or worse, is that it's one of the relatively few shows in this exact space that eventually noticed the problem, named it by changing its own format, and actually tried to write its way out of it before the story ended for good. Whether it fully succeeded is something reasonable people can keep arguing about, but the attempt itself, I think, deserves more credit than it usually gets in conversations that are mostly focused on how badly things went at one particular wedding. There's something else worth naming honestly, before we start bringing this whole thing together, which is that the sheer volume and intensity of fan anger directed at Mordecai over these years is itself a kind of evidence, just not the kind that supports the argument it usually gets used for. Nobody writes a multi-year forum thread. Nobody builds an entry on a page dedicated to tracking a show's most divisive moments. Nobody sits down and titles a whole post after a single episode calling it a character's worst moment, about a character they never cared about in the first place. You don't get angry at a stranger. You get angry at someone you'd spent years rooting for, someone whose earlier decency you'd taken, reasonably, as a kind of promise about who they were going to keep being. The scale of the backlash to Dumped at the Altar isn't really proof that Regular Show forgot how to write Mordecai. It's proof that the series had, for 5 seasons before that, written him well enough that a whole audience felt entitled to be disappointed in him when he finally let them down. That's not nothing. A character nobody was invested in couldn't generate this kind of reaction if the writers tried. It's also worth being precise, now that we've walked through all 8 years of this together, about what actually happened here versus what the word ruined tends to imply when people reach for it. Because I think the word does some quiet exaggerating on its own, just by existing. Ruin suggests something permanent, something that can't be undone, a character who ends the show as a worse, less coherent, less likable version of who he started as. And having gone through this season by season, I don't think that's quite an honest description of the whole 8 years, even though I understand exactly why it's the word people reach for. What actually happened looks more like this. A likable, relatably flawed character got handed increasingly serious romantic stakes to carry as real drama rather than comedic misunderstanding, largely alongside a candidly turbulent, well-documented period of staff turnover and shrinking creative resources behind the camera. In one specific finale, that shift produced a openly ugly, hard-to-defend moment, arguably the character's worst across the entire run, one that did real, lasting damage to how a meaningful chunk of the audience felt about him afterward, and one Regular Show never circled back to make him properly reckoned with on screen. But the very next season, the same writing team proved they could still handle this exact kind of material, with grace and mutual respect. And the finale, several seasons after that, gave him an ending built around quiet, earned personal growth rather than romantic vindication, closing out a thread about art and self-worth that had been sitting patiently in the background since the very first year of the series. That's not the shape of a character who got ruined and stayed ruined. It's the shape of a character who got mishandled, badly, at a specific, identifiable low point, inside a show that was visibly losing some of the people who'd helped build him, and who the remaining team then found their way back to, imperfectly, by changing what the story needed from him, rather than by ever directly apologizing for what came before. I think that's a more honest, and honestly more interesting story than a clean, one-directional fall from grace. It's messier. It doesn't resolve into a tidy verdict you can sum up in a single sentence for a video title. But 8 years of anything, even 8 years of a cartoon about two guys who cut grass for a living, we're never going to resolve that neatly anyway. If you actually lay all 8 of these years out side by side, rather than jumping straight to the wedding the way most conversations about this character tend to, the shape of the whole thing looks less like a ramp sliding steadily downward, and more like a walk with a couple of very specific, very steep drops in it, and long, mostly level stretches in between. Season 1 and Season 2 give you the baseline, an insecure, well-meaning guy who lies badly to impress a woman he likes, and gets dragged through disasters by a friend who treats responsibility as a personal insult, and almost nobody looking back on those years has any real complaint about how he's written, because the series never asks him to be anything more complicated than exactly that. Season 3 takes that same baseline and finally gives it real romantic stakes. A triangle, a storm cloud girlfriend, a first kiss that gets erased by a time machine before it can even properly count. And it does all of that as comedy first, drama second, which is exactly why it's remembered as one of regular show's best stretches rather than a controversial one. Season 4 takes the training wheels off, lets 4 years of patient build-up finally pay off in a real kiss at an airport gate, and then breaks his heart cleanly, honestly, through nobody's fault at all, in what I'd still call the single best piece of heartbreak writing regular show ever produces for him. Season 5 is the quiet one, a new relationship starting up fast enough that some viewers, fairly or not, read a little unprocessed grief underneath its warmth, while behind the scenes the room that built those first 4 years starts, for the first time, to lose people. Season 6 is the steep drop, the one everyone remembers, the one this whole video really exists to talk about. A season where a real production shakeup lines up almost exactly with the worst thing this character ever does on screen, hijacking a friend's wedding to break up with his girlfriend without so much as looking at her while he does it, and then never being made to properly answer for it. Season 7, remarkably, doesn't continue that slide. It reverses it for at least one relationship, giving Margaret and Mordecai the mature, mutual, dignified ending CJ never got, even while regular show's real-world ratings were falling further than they ever had. And Season 8 changes the entire shape of the story around him, trading romantic drama for cosmic stakes almost entirely, which, whether by design or by accident, lets his best qualities matter again simply because the plot stopped needing his worst ones, before finally sending him off into a life built on the one ambition the series had been patiently holding in reserve since its very first year. Told that way, season by season, the way this whole video promised at the start, it's a story with a real, undeniable low point, but not a story of uninterrupted decline. And I think that distinction actually matters if you care about being fair to the people who made this show across 8 years of a fully difficult, constantly shifting production. It would be easy, and honestly a little lazy, to build an entire video around one bad wedding speech and call it a day. That speech deserves the attention it gets. But it doesn't deserve to be the entire story, because the entire story includes a season immediately afterward where the same team proved they hadn't lost the ability to do this material justice at all. There's something quietly moving, to me at least, about watching a show work through its own equivalent of what its main character goes through. Regular show spends its middle years losing pieces of the team that built it, taking network notes it didn't necessarily want, watching its audience shrink season over season, and somewhere in the middle of all that instability, it stumbles, badly, publicly, in a way a lot of longtime viewers still haven't forgiven it for. And then, rather than simply fading out on that low note the way plenty of shows in its position might have, it finds one more gear, tries something it had never attempted before, and closes out its own story with a genuine, hard-won piece of grace. A character finally choosing his own life instead of waiting for it to happen to him. A friendship still intact after decades. An ending that earns its warmth rather than simply asserting it. The show, in other words, ends up telling roughly the same story about itself that it tells about Mordecai. A rough middle stretch, some real, undeniable damage along the way, and a landing that mostly, if imperfectly, sticks. I don't think that makes the wedding hurt any less, and I don't think it should, but I think it's the more honest way to hold this whole 8-year story in your head, rather than flattening it down into a single clean verdict that either lets the series entirely off the hook or writes off everything it accomplished because of one especially bad season. Both of those simpler versions are more comfortable than the real one. Neither of them is quite true. There's one more comparison worth making before we start winding down tonight, and it's not one you hear brought up very often in these conversations. But I think it puts Mordecai's handling of grief in a much sharper light than anything we've discussed so far. Because this show actually gives us a working model, elsewhere in its own cast, of what it looks like to take heartbreak seriously across a long span of time, and it belongs to Skips. Skips, the impossibly calm, endlessly knowledgeable groundskeeper who's been the moral center of this cast since its earliest years, carries a piece of backstory that the show reveals gradually rather than all at once. Long before he was Skips, he was a young man, going by a different name, at a prom, with a girlfriend named Mona, and that night, a cosmic villain named Clorgbane the Destroyer took her from him. What regular show does with that loss is remarkable, when you actually stop and look at it. Skips doesn't get to simply move on. He's offered immortality by a group of beings who oversee this side of the series' cosmology, specifically so he can keep fighting Clorgbane every time the villain resurfaces. On a recurring cycle the series pegs at 157 years, and he accepts, taking on a whole new name, Skips, specifically to honor Mona's memory every single time he introduces himself, for what is by now centuries. He has to perform an annual ritual, a kind of spirit dance, just to maintain the immortality that lets him keep this promise going. His last confirmed encounter with Clorgbane happens in the Season 3 episode we talked about earlier tonight, the one with the magic gauntlets, and it is careful never to suggest that fight is over for good. Sit with what that actually is, dramatically, for a second. It's a character who took a single, devastating loss and turned the rest of his impossibly long life into a structure built entirely around honoring it. A promise kept literally for centuries, a name changed and worn every day since as a form of memorial. That's an enormous amount of narrative weight for a background character who mostly exists in any given episode to dispense calm advice and the occasional bit of impossible physical strength. And it tells you that this show, when it wants to, is fully capable of treating heartbreak as something that actually costs a person something lasting, something that reshapes an entire life rather than something that gets processed off-screen between one season and the next. Now hold that up against Mordecai, a man who spends 4 years building toward a future with Margaret, has his heart broken cleanly and sympathetically at the end of Season 4, and is in a new, official relationship again well within the very next season, without the show ever really pausing to show us what, if anything, he did with that grief in between. I flagged this back when we were walking through Season 5 as a reading some fans have arrived at rather than something the series confirms, and I'll keep that same honesty here. Nothing on screen explicitly tells us CJ was a rebound, and nothing about their relationship is written as though it's meant to be seen that way while it's actually happening. But placed next to Skips, whose entire immortal existence is a monument to a single loss he refuses to simply move past, Mordecai's comparatively brisk turnaround does read differently than it might in isolation. It's not that the series doesn't know how to write grief with real weight. It clearly does. We just watched it do exactly that for one of its most beloved supporting characters. It's that it mostly chooses not to extend that same patience to Mordecai's own losses, treating his heartbreaks as narrative hinges to swing the plot from one relationship into the next, rather than as wounds worth lingering on the way Skips's loss gets to linger, for centuries, in plain sight. I think that's worth saying plainly as one more thread in why his romantic writing ends up feeling thinner than it maybe should, given how much runtime the series spends on it. It's not only that his flaws get put under more dramatic pressure as the seasons go on. It's that regular show, which has already proven elsewhere in its own cast that it knows how to let loss actually mean something over time, mostly declines to give that same treatment to its own romantic lead, and instead keeps moving him briskly from one relationship's ending straight into the next one's beginning, right up until the wedding that finally forces the issue into the open, publicly, badly, years later than it probably should have. There's a real-world thread worth pulling on here too, one that's necessarily speculative, since no interview or commentary from anyone who actually worked on this show discusses deliberately reshaping Mordecai's character in the way we're describing tonight. Nobody involved has ever gone on record saying they decided to make his romantic life carry heavier dramatic weight, as some kind of compensation for anything else. I want to be honest about that gap, because pretending otherwise would be precisely the sort of unearned, invented certainty this channel has been burned by before. But it's worth noticing, as pure pattern rather than confirmed cause, that the years this show was reportedly being pushed by its network to soften some of its edgier, more adult-coded humor, the innuendo, the looser jokes about grown-up vices that populated a lot of its earliest seasons, are roughly the same years its romantic storylines start being asked to carry more genuine emotional stakes, rather than existing mainly as another flavor of joke. It's entirely possible those two trends are unrelated, two separate consequences of the same broadly maturing, slowly turning over production, rather than one causing the other. But it's also possible, and again this is speculation, clearly labeled as such, that as one avenue for regular shows' more grown-up, less strictly kid-facing instincts got narrowed, some of that same appetite for material with real adult stakes found a new outlet in the relationship storylines instead, which would explain, at least partly, why those storylines start feeling weightier and more consequential right around the same stretch of seasons the series was reportedly being told to tone other things down. I'll leave that one exactly where it belongs, as a plausible pattern rather than a settled explanation, because treating it as more than that would be the sort of overreach this whole video has tried hard to avoid. But it's a useful reminder, heading into the last stretch of tonight, that everything we've walked through, the wedding, the staff departures, the ratings, the eventual finale, sits inside a much larger, messier set of pressures that any single explanation is going to flatten if you let it. There's one last angle worth considering before we close things out, and it has less to do with the show itself than with who's actually doing the watching, because I think it goes a long way toward explaining why this specific conversation, the ruined Mordecai conversation, tends to happen mostly in retrospect, years after these episodes originally aired, rather than in the moment they were airing. Regular show premiered on a children's network, aimed, at least on the surface, at a young audience alongside whatever older viewers happened to stick around for its sharper jokes. A kid watching this show live, in real time, week to week, across 2010 through 2017, is mostly clocking the parts of the series built for a kid to clock. The moon landings, the magic gauntlets, the chaos of two groundskeepers running from their own bad decisions. Romantic subplots, even handled as clumsily as this one eventually gets handled, tend to read very differently to an 8 or 10-year-old watching along than they do to that same person rewatching regular show a decade later as an adult who has, in the intervening years, been through actual relationships of their own, actual breakups, actual moments of having to decide whether to have an honest conversation with someone or take the easier, more cowardly way out. The wedding hijacking probably read, to a lot of kids watching it live, as just another big dramatic cartoon set piece, a wedding gone wrong, mildly sad, quickly moved past. It's the adult rewatch, the version where you're old enough to recognize exactly what kind of person publicly humiliates a partner rather than having a private, honest conversation with them, that turns this into the defining, unforgivable low point fans talk about now. That's not a criticism of anyone's original viewing experience, and it's not meant to suggest kids simply missed something obvious. It's meant to point at something true about how a show like this ages, and how a specific kind of discourse around it tends to form. Most of the loudest, most detailed ruined Mordecai conversation online happens among people revisiting this show well into adulthood, often specifically because a channel like this one exists, built around exactly that kind of nostalgic rewatch. People coming back to a show they first watched as children, now noticing things about it their younger selves genuinely couldn't have. Regular show didn't change between those two viewings. The audience did. And I think that's worth holding on to honestly as we close out tonight. because a big part of why this particular character's arc generates this much passionate, detailed argument, this many forum threads, this much genuine anger over a single wedding speech, isn't only about what happened on screen. It's about how differently that same 11 minutes of animation lands on a person who's grown up enough, in the years since, to actually recognize themselves, or someone they've hurt, or someone who's hurt them, somewhere inside it. There's one more character worth bringing into this conversation before we close it out, mostly because I think the comparison is a little funny, in a bittersweet way, and I don't think it gets made often enough. Muscle Man, whose whole comedic identity across this show's run is built around being crude, a little dim, obsessed with cheap jokes about his mother, is not, by any reasonable measure, the emotionally sophisticated member of this friend group. He's not the one anyone would point to, watching those first couple of seasons, as the character most likely to end up in a stable, lasting relationship. And yet it's his wedding, to a woman named Starla, that actually happens on screen, that actually gets celebrated by the whole cast, and it's his relationship that, by the time we reach the finale a couple of seasons later, has turned into an actual family. Meanwhile, Mordecai, established from episode 1 as the steadier, more mature one in his own friendship, spends those same years cycling through a devastating breakup, an unprocessed rebound, and a public humiliation of his own girlfriend, at, of all places, Muscle Man's own wedding. I don't think the show is trying to make a pointed argument here about who deserves love more, and I'd be overreaching if I framed it that way. But there's something almost accidentally poignant about the fact that the character built, structurally, from day one, to be the responsible, together one, ends up being the one whose romantic life actually implodes in public, while the character built to be the crude comic relief just gets to be happy, married, a father, present and content in the same reunion scene, where Mordecai's own path to happiness runs through leaving the park entirely and starting over with someone new. It's a nice reminder, honestly, that this show never really promised its characters' emotional maturity would track cleanly with how mature they seemed on the surface, and that maybe the entire premise of ranking these people against each other by how well they handle romance was always going to produce some uncomfortable, slightly funny results once you actually lay all their outcomes side by side. Rigby gets a version of that same slow, patient payoff too, in his own much quieter way. For years, running alongside everything we've spent tonight discussing, there's a low-key thread involving Rigby and a coworker named Eileen, one that takes even longer to resolve into anything than Mordecai's various relationships do, mostly because Rigby, true to form, avoids dealing with his own feelings even more thoroughly than Mordecai avoids his. But by the time the finale's timeskip arrives, the two of them have ended up together as well, without any of the spectacle or wreckage that defined the CJ storyline. It's a small detail, easy to miss amid everything bigger happening in that finale. But it's one more data point suggesting this cast, taken as a whole, mostly does find its way to some kind of peace by the end, even when getting there took the entire runtime of an 8-year show to happen. There's a small detail buried inside the wedding disaster that I don't think gets nearly enough attention, and I want to pull out on its own before we wind down, because I think it's almost darkly funny once you actually notice it. What sets the whole thing off isn't jealousy, or a fight, or anything you'd normally expect to detonate a relationship in front of a crowd. It's a letter about honesty. Somebody, in the middle of a wedding, hands Mordecai something meant to be about telling the truth, and what he does with that prompt is turn it into the single most dishonest, most self-serving act we ever see him commit, a public performance of vulnerability that conveniently spares him the actual hard part, looking the person he's hurting in the eye and telling her directly. That's a familiar shape if you watch enough television. Honestly, this idea of an honesty exercise or a truth-telling ritual going catastrophically wrong at a wedding or a funeral or some other occasion where everyone's already gathered and emotionally raw. It's a reliable device because it's efficient. It gets a whole room full of reactions out of a single confession without the writers needing to stage a dozen separate private conversations. But it's worth noticing what that efficiency costs here specifically. Real honesty, the kind that actually respects another person, is quiet, direct, and uncomfortable in a very particular, private way. What Mordecai does at that wedding is the opposite of that on every axis. It's loud, it's indirect, since he never even looks at CJ while delivering it. And it's uncomfortable in a very public, performative way that puts the burden of interpreting his own feelings onto a room full of bystanders rather than onto the one person who actually deserved to hear them plainly. The series hands him a device explicitly about truth-telling, and he uses it to avoid the one true, hard conversation he actually owed somebody. I don't think that irony was necessarily intended as commentary by whoever wrote that episode. But intended or not, it's sitting right there in the scene, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. And it's part of why I think this specific moment lands as such a clean encapsulation of everything we've been circling all night. Even when the story hands him the exact tool for doing the right thing, he finds a way to use it to do the wrong one instead. It helps to step back, for a moment, from the emotional content of any of this, and looking at the mechanics of how regular show actually tells its stories, because there's a pattern running underneath almost everything we've talked about tonight that's easy to miss when you're focused on any single episode. This is a show that consistently routes its biggest emotional and plot turns through small, physical objects. A stolen keyboard sends a coworker to the moon and defines regular show's entire tonal contract in its very first episode. A cheap, homemade time machine undoes a botched first kiss and later reopens an entire season's premiere. A charm bracelet, handed over and returned, becomes the single physical gesture that tells you a years-long relationship is actually over, more clearly than any line of dialogue in that scene does. Even the finale's central object, in its own way, a videotape standing in for a missing memory in the framing device of the 2026 revival, keeps that same instinct alive years later. This is a show that trusts a small, tangible thing to carry weight that 100 lines of dialogue might otherwise have to do instead, and it's part of why so many of these individual moments stick in memory so vividly, even years after a viewer last watched them. You don't need to remember the exact wording of what anyone said at that wedding. You remember the bracelet coming off her wrist. I think that's worth spelling out, because it's part of why the series' failures land as hard as its successes do. When an object carries that much weight, a keyboard, a time machine, a bracelet, the show is making an implicit promise that the moment attached to it actually matters, that it's been built with intention rather than tossed off as one more beat in a long list of beats. That promise is exactly why handing CJ's bracelet back and having her simply walk out, with no scene afterward giving her anything more to do or say, reads as such a stark, final, almost brutal piece of storytelling shorthand. The series used its own established visual language, small object equals big meaning, and then applied that language to end her arc, rather than to develop it further. It's efficient. It's also, I think, part of why that ending feels so cold in retrospect, precisely because regular show had already taught its audience, through years of using objects this way, to take that gesture completely seriously. There's one more thread of context worth pulling in before we head toward the close of tonight's video, and it has to do with where this whole show actually came from in the first place. Regular show didn't begin as a network pitch built by committee. It grew out of a student film G. Quintel made while he was still at CalArts, back in 2009, a small, personal project that a network then picked up and expanded into a series that would go on to run for 8 years and, eventually, spawn a whole additional revival nearly a decade after its finale aired. Quintel stayed attached to this thing as its creator and its guiding executive producer, from that very first student short all the way through to the 3-part finale special that closed it out, and, as we discussed earlier, all the way through to showrunning the 2026 revival as well. That's an unusually long, unusually personal thread of authorship for a show that otherwise saw so much turnover underneath him. Co-supervising producers coming and going, storyboard directors departing, even the character designer changing hands in the final season. I think that's worth sitting alongside everything else we've covered tonight, because it complicates the idea of a show simply drifting away from its creator's original vision as the years went on. The vision, in the person of Quintel himself, never actually left the building. What changed was who was helping translate that vision into scripts and boards on a week-to-week basis, which is a different, subtler kind of instability than a full creative regime change would be. A show can keep its single guiding hand at the top for its entire run and still feel meaningfully different in its back half, simply because so much of the actual day-to-day texture of a series, the specific jokes, the specific pacing of a scene, the specific choice of whether a character looks at someone while breaking their heart, gets made by the people in the room underneath that guiding hand, not by the person at the very top alone. Regular show's own history is a pretty clean illustration of that distinction. A single, consistent author presiding over a genuinely inconsistent room. And it's about as honest a single-sentence summary as you'll find for why a show can stay recognizably itself in its broadest strokes while still drifting, unevenly, in how it handles one specific character's most personal moments. There's a strange, almost too neat little irony sitting right in this show's own title, one that rarely gets talked about, and it's worth pulling out here at the end, because I think it says something true about the whole 8 years we've just walked through. The series calls itself Regular Show, a title that's basically a joke about how ordinary its premise sounds. 2 guys cutting grass, running errands, avoiding their boss, dressed up as though that's genuinely all there is to it. And the entire engine of the series, from that very first stolen keyboard onward, is the gap between that flatly ordinary title and the increasingly cosmic, increasingly mythic events that keep happening to these specific, unremarkable people. Pops turns out to be a god. Skips turns out to be centuries old. A missed shift turns into a moon landing. Nothing about this show, once you actually look at it, is regular at all. And the title is basically daring you to notice that contradiction from the very beginning. Mordecai's own ending plays into that same joke in a way I don't think is an accident, even if nobody involved in making the finale ever framed it quite this way on the record. For years, his entire romantic arc is defined by exactly the kind of regular, expected shape you'd assume a show like this would eventually deliver. Boy meets girl at a coffee shop. Boy loses girl. Boy dates someone new. Boy eventually ends up with one of the 2 women the story spent years building up. That's the regular ending. That's the one the title of this show would have you expect, on its most surface reading. And the actual finale refuses to give him that. He doesn't end up with Margaret. He doesn't end up with CJ. He ends up leaving the park entirely, marrying someone the audience has never met before, becoming a painter, living a life that has nothing to do with the premise Regular Show spent 8 years training you to expect. In its own way, that's a genuinely fitting ending for this specific show to have handed him. A character whose entire life, structurally, was always going to refuse to be regular, dressed up right until the final minutes, as though it might actually settle into something ordinary and expected after all. And that brings us, one last time, to Pops, because I think his own reveal works as a kind of quiet mirror for the whole argument we've been building about how this show hides its real stakes underneath a deceptively gentle surface. For years, Pops is just a strange, formal, oddly cheerful supporting character, the boss's son, mostly there for a certain kind of whimsical comic relief. And then the finale reveals he was, this entire time, the physical embodiment of goodness itself in a cosmic order most of the cast never knew existed, carrying a burden and a destiny that dwarfs literally everything else that happened across the previous 7 years combined. That's the same trick the show plays with Mordecai's own story, just compressed into a single character and a single revelation instead of stretched across 8 years of romantic misadventure. A gentle, unassuming surface, hiding something with real weight and real stakes underneath it, waiting for the moment the story finally decides it's ready to show you what was actually there all along. Regular Show earns its own title by constantly proving it was lying to you about how regular any of this ever really was, right up to its very last episode. There's another pattern worth naming before we get to that friendship, one that runs alongside the objects we already talked about, and it has to do with how often this specific show reaches for erasure as its go-to move whenever a romantic beat threatens to become permanent too soon. Go back through everything we've covered tonight and count how many times a piece of Mordecai's romantic progress gets literally undone rather than simply continuing forward. The first kiss with Margaret, in Bad Kiss, doesn't just go badly. It gets wiped out entirely by a time machine, reset back to a version of events where it never technically happened. The Christmas kiss with Margaret years later isn't framed as a real, weighed decision. It's described, even in how we discussed it earlier tonight, as almost accidental. A lapse rather than a choice, something that happens to him rather than something he does. And CJ's entire relationship, once it ends, doesn't just conclude, it gets erased from the ongoing life of the friend group entirely. A person who used to be there constantly, reduced to a pair of brief, wordless appearances, and then nothing. I think that's a truly useful thing to notice as its own through line, separate from anything we've already said about objects or about staff turnover. because it suggests the series has a kind of structural discomfort with letting romantic progress simply stick and be dealt with directly. Undoing is always the easier move than reckoning. A cheap time machine is a cleaner storytelling solution than an awkward morning after conversation about bad breath. A convenient, "it just happened" framing is easier to write than an honest scene where two people actually choose, with full awareness, to cross a line they know will hurt someone else. And silence and absence are easier to sustain than an actual reconciliation scene that would require the series to let Mordecai and CJ sit in a room together and have the conversation that wedding never gave her. Every one of these choices takes the harder, more honest version of the scene off the table, in favor of a cleaner reset. That's not necessarily a flaw unique to how this show handles Mordecai. Plenty of long-running comedies lean on reset buttons to keep their format sustainable across years of episodes. But it does mean that when regular show finally does let something stick, permanently, irreversibly, the CJ breakup being the clearest example, that permanence lands with unusual weight, precisely because it's so rare for this show to let anything involving Mordecai's romantic life actually stay broken, rather than resetting itself by the next relevant episode. There's also a quieter structural reason nobody in this world ever really makes Mordecai answer for what happens at that wedding, and I think it deserves naming plainly, because it's easy to miss if you're only thinking about the story in terms of what Mordecai himself chooses to do or not do. Benson, the one authority figure who exists consistently across this entire show, cares, almost exclusively, about one specific thing: whether the park's grounds are being maintained properly, and whether his employees are doing their actual jobs. He's ferociously invested in workplace competence and almost entirely absent from anything resembling emotional or moral guidance in these characters' personal lives. He'll scream at Mordecai over a missed shift or a ruined flower bed without hesitation. He never once, across 8 years, sits Mordecai down about how he treats the people he dates. There's simply no adult in this show's structure positioned to do that kind of intervening. No authority figure whose job, as regular show has built it, includes holding these two groundskeepers accountable for anything beyond lawn care. Skips comes closest to a wisdom figure in this cast, and even he mostly involves himself in cosmic threats and impossible feats of strength rather than relationship counseling. Which means that when Mordecai does something as flatly indefensible as hijacking a friend's wedding, there's no one built into this show's own internal logic whose role it would even make sense for them to step in and call him out on it directly. The silence that follows that wedding isn't just a writing choice about pacing or closure. It's baked into who this cast actually is, and what these characters, by design, do and don't hold each other responsible for. Before we finish up completely, I want to be honest about something regarding how a video like this actually gets put together, because I think it matters, especially on a channel that's gotten a couple of details wrong in the past and had sharp-eyed viewers catch it. A lot of what circulates online about a show like this, the exact wording of a fan theory, the precise framing of a trope page, the specific numbers behind a viewership chart, comes from sources of wildly varying reliability, and it would have been easy, putting this particular video together, to just repeat whichever most dramatic-sounding version of a claim was floating around, because dramatic claims make for a punchier video. We tried hard not to do that here, where a number couldn't actually be verified, like that supposed 9.3 to 3.2 review score collapse. We said so plainly, instead of using it anyway, just because it happened to support the argument. Where a piece of backstory had already tripped this channel up before, the specifics of how Benson became manager, the true origin of that stolen keyboard back in the first episode, we went back and got it right this time, rather than letting an old mistake calcify into something viewers just have to keep correcting for us. That kind of care isn't especially exciting to talk about in the middle of a video about wedding disasters and cosmic gods, but it's the actual backbone of what a channel like this owes you, the quiet trust that what you're hearing is actually true rather than just entertaining. I'd rather tell you a messier, more honest version of this story, one with real uncertainty built into it, real disagreements between what critics said and what fans felt, real gaps where the record simply doesn't support a confident answer, then hand you a tidy, satisfying narrative that happens to be wrong in 3 or 4 places nobody bothered to check. Regular show earned 8 years and 200 and some episodes of genuine audience attention, and whatever you walk away from tonight believing about Mordecai specifically, I'd rather you walk away having actually learned something true about how this show came together, who made it, what changed behind the scenes, and why, rather than just another confident-sounding version of a rumor that happened to make for a better story. There's one last question worth asking before we head into that friendship for good, and it's a simple one that rarely gets asked out loud. Why Mordecai specifically? Rigby spends this entire show avoiding responsibility, lying constantly, treating basic adult obligations as things to be dodged rather than met. And he mostly gets a pass for it, treated as comic relief rather than as someone whose character was ruined by anything. Nobody's writing forum posts about how badly the show handled Rigby's arc. So why does the exact same show, cycling through the exact same kinds of avoidance and cowardice, get treated so much more harshly when it's Mordecai doing the avoiding? I think the honest answer is that the series set its own terms for how each of these two characters would be judged, right back in season 1, and then held Mordecai to the standard it built for him specifically. Rigby was introduced as chaos, and chaos behaving chaotically doesn't really register as a betrayal. It just registers as the character being exactly who he was always going to be. Mordecai, by contrast, was introduced as the steadier one, the one who at least tried to do right by people. The one the show coded, subtly but consistently, as somebody worth trusting a little more than his best friend. That framing is a promise, whether the writers meant it as one or not, and promises like that get remembered by an audience even when regular show itself moves on to other things. When Rigby avoids a hard conversation, it plays as business as usual. When Mordecai does the exact same thing, at a friend's wedding, in front of everyone, it plays as a betrayal of something the series spent its very first seasons asking you to believe about him. The anger isn't really about the specific act of cowardice in isolation. It's about the gap between that act and the standard the character himself was built to represent from the very beginning. You don't get angry at chaos for being chaotic. You get angry at steadiness for finally cracking. It pays to look, for a moment, at how that same tension plays out one final time inside the finale itself, because I think it's the clearest possible demonstration of what this show was actually doing, tonally, across its entire run, compressed down into a single 3-part special. In the space of roughly half an hour, a regular epic final battle asks its audience to sit through a permanent, devastating loss unlike anything else regular show ever depicts. An old friend flying willingly into the sun to save everyone else, and then, almost immediately afterward, hands that same audience one of the warmest, gentlest, purely happy endings regular show ever produces, a reunion at the same park decades later, old friends playing arcade games, a marriage, children, a painting career finally realized, grief and joy, sitting directly next to each other, with barely a scene of buffer between them. That's not an accident, and it's not a tonal misstep either, once you consider everything we've spent tonight walking through. It's the exact same move this show has been making since its very first episode, when a stolen keyboard and a moon landing sat comfortably next to two guys just trying to avoid mowing a lawn. Regular show was never a show that treated its comedy and its stakes, or its joy and its grief, as things that needed to be kept in separate rooms. It let a missed shift become a life or death emergency in its first 10 minutes on the air. And it lets a god's permanent sacrifice sit directly beside a group of old friends laughing over a claw machine in its very last 10 minutes. Mordecai's own ending belongs inside that exact same tonal logic. His happiness at the end doesn't cancel out or apologize for the wedding several seasons earlier, the same way Pops's death doesn't cancel out the joy of everyone else's reunion. The show simply never believed those things needed to cancel each other out in the first place. It let the hurt be real. It let the happiness be real too, and it trusted its audience to hold both without needing either one resolved into a tidier, more comfortable single verdict. If you strip away every individual episode we've covered tonight and just look for the single dividing line that actually separates the versions of this story that land well from the versions that land badly, I don't think it's really about fault or circumstance or even about how much warning either party gets. It's about audience. It's about who else is in the room. Every one of Mordecai's romantic moments that this video has held up as genuinely well handled happens, essentially, in private, or in front of at most one other person who's directly involved. The airport gate kiss with Margaret is just the two of them. The fancy dinner where she tells him about Milton University is just the two of them. A quiet, devastating conversation with no audience to perform for or hide behind. The fortune teller's vision, and the conversation that follows in Just Friends, plays out as an intimate exchange between two people being honest with each other, not a show being staged for anyone else's benefit. And every moment this video has held up as a genuine low point involves an audience, a crowd, witnesses, someone or something turning what should be a private reckoning into a spectacle. The storm CJ becomes in Yes Dude Yes happens in a public coffee shop, in front of customers and Margaret both, even if in that instance, it's Mordecai's mistake creating the crowd rather than the crowd being the point. And the wedding, obviously, is the extreme version of this. An entire audience of friends and family conscripted, without their consent, into witnessing a breakup they had no reason to be part of. I think that's a truly useful lens for understanding what actually went wrong at that wedding. Maybe more useful than framing it purely as a question of Mordecai's character flaws in the abstract. It's not simply that he's a coward, though he clearly is one in that moment. It's that he takes a decision that only ever should have involved two people and inflates it into a performance for dozens, which does something specific and cruel to the person on the receiving end. Private honesty, however painful, at least treats the other person as someone worth talking to directly. Public spectacle treats them as scenery, a supporting character in his own emotional crisis, there to be reacted to rather than actually spoken with. That's the real difference between the version of Heartbreak this show handles with grace and the version it handles disastrously. And once you notice it, it's hard not to see it as the clearest single thread running underneath everything we've covered tonight. Cleaner, honestly, than production turnover, or ratings charts, or any of the other explanations we've spent time on. Sometimes the difference between a beautiful scene and a devastating one isn't what happens. It's simply who's allowed to watch it happen. There's something fitting, given everything we've just spent the last several hours walking through together, about telling this particular story in this particular format, at a slower pace than the series itself ever moved at. Regular show, on screen, was frantic. 11 minutes of escalating chaos packed into every episode, jokes stacked on top of jokes, a moon landing squeezed into the same runtime as a missed shift. Slowing all of that down, pulling it apart season by season, lingering on the quieter through lines underneath the jokes, the staff departures, the ratings charts, the small objects carrying enormous emotional weight, is almost the opposite experience of watching the series live. But I think it suits the material better than you'd expect. Because underneath all that frantic energy, this was always a show about people who cared about each other, trying, however clumsily, to hold on to that care while their whole world kept shifting underneath them. That's a story that rewards this kind of slow, patient retelling, the kind that gives itself room, rather than the kind built for a fast scroll or a quick highlight reel. There's one last piece of context worth putting on the table, because I think it undercuts an assumption a lot of people bring into conversations like this one, without ever stating it outright. When a long-running show is accused of declining, the instinct is usually to look for a single, clean villain behind it. Most often a showrunner who left, a creator who lost interest, somebody at the very top who simply stopped caring. That's not what happened here. J.G. Quintel never left this project. He created it, ran it, and stayed attached to it from a student film in 2009 all the way through a finale special in 2017, and then came back nearly a decade later to run the revival as well. There was no single departure at the top you can point to and say, there, that's when it broke. What actually happened is less satisfying as a headline and more useful as an honest lesson about how television actually gets made. A show can keep its creator, its vision, its basic sense of humor, completely intact at the very top, and still shift meaningfully underneath that person, simply because of who else is or isn't in the room, translating that vision into finished episodes week after week. 2 co-supervising producers leaving, a longtime storyboard director leaving, a character designer changing mid-season. None of these individually reads as a dramatic enough event to explain a whole character's arc souring. Stacked together, across 5 or 6 years, they add up to something real. If you're looking for a tidy answer to why any of this happened, one bad decision, one person to blame, this story simply won't give it to you. What it gives you instead is something closer to the truth of how most long-running creative work actually falls apart or holds together, slowly, unevenly, through dozens of small decisions made by dozens of different people, none of them alone responsible for the whole picture. Even something as basic as counting up how many episodes of this show actually exist turns out to be harder to pin down than you'd expect. And I think it's a fitting last example of the kind of honesty this whole video has tried to practice. Wikipedia's own episode listing puts the total at 244 episodes across all 8 seasons, which is the figure we've relied on tonight. But other trackers put the number closer to 246, and at least one other source puts it as high as 261, largely because different pages count things like multi-part specials, either as one entry or several. Even the final season alone gets counted 2 different ways, either 27 or 28 episodes long, depending entirely on whether you split its 3-part finale into separate entries or treat it as one. None of that changes anything about the actual story of this show, but it's a small, useful reminder that even a straightforward, purely factual question like how many episodes of regular show exist doesn't have one single, universally agreed upon answer. And if a question that simple can resist a clean number, it's worth extending that same humility to every messier, more subjective question this video has actually spent its time on tonight. There's a further piece of this show's own relationship with its continuity worth bringing up here, because it draws an interesting line right next to everything we've spent tonight picking apart. Regular show has an entire recurring tradition of Halloween specials, called Terror Tales of the Park, built in the same spirit as the kind of anthology horror special other animated comedies have used for decades. In-universe scary stories the characters tell each other, rather than events that actually happen to them. Characters can die gruesomely in these specials, storylines can end in total disaster, and none of it touches the show's actual continuity in the slightest, because regular show is explicit that these are campfire stories, not history. It's a clean, honest device. The series tells you plainly, this doesn't count, and then lets itself get as dark and strange as it wants inside that safe little bubble. What's worth noticing is how differently the show treats the things that do count. There's no equivalent framing device that lets Mordecai's worst moment simply not have happened. No campfire story wrapper around that wedding that would let regular show or the audience treat it as something safely outside the real timeline. It happened. It's canon. It's exactly as permanent as Pop's flying into the sun, or Margaret's decision to leave for Milton, or CJ walking out of that reception in tears. The series clearly knows how to draw a hard line around the events it doesn't want held against its characters, because it draws that line explicitly, every single Halloween, and simply chooses not to draw it around this specific story. That's not a flaw in the writing so much as it's a kind of honesty by omission. Regular show never once suggests the wedding was anything other than exactly what it looked like. It just also never quite gives Mordecai, or CJ, or the audience, the scene where anyone actually has to say so out loud. One small image from that same finale epilogue is worth holding on to as we close this out, because it belongs to Skips, and it's the closest thing this show gives to a direct answer about what an unbroken promise actually looks like decades later. When the story jumps forward 25 years, Skips is still there, at the same park, still doing the work he's always done, apparently untouched by the passage of time in the way only he could be. He's outlived the entire timeline this show ever depicted, still bound by that same annual ritual, still carrying Mona's name into every introduction he makes, presumably still ready for whatever comes around on that 157-year clock the series was always careful never to say had actually finished. Everyone else in that reunion has visibly aged, built new lives, moved somewhere new. Skips alone stands still, the one constant the whole cast gets to return to. Decades on, exactly where they left him. There's something oddly comforting in that image, and I think it's a fitting note to end on. Regular show spent 8 years, on and off, showing you a group of friends figuring out, unevenly and sometimes badly, how to hold on to each other while everything around them kept shifting. Careers, relationships, entire staffs of writers coming and going behind the scenes. And at the very end of all of it, regular show gives you one character who never had to figure any of that out, because he simply never let go in the first place. Maybe that's the real, quiet answer this whole show ends up offering to the question its own title keeps pretending is a joke. Nothing about any of this was ever regular. But some things, if you're lucky, and if you're patient enough, manage to stay exactly where you left them. Benson gets his own small version of that same continuity, and I want to close on, because it loops back around to somebody we barely mentioned tonight, outside of one brief correction earlier on. Benson, whose own path to running this park started with getting fired from a hair metal band and eventually taking over from a manager named Talks, is still managing that same park in the finale's epilogue, decades into a job he originally only landed because somebody else's tenure ended. He spent this whole show as the furious, red-faced authority figure standing over Mordecai and Rigby's every failure, and by the time we reach the last scene this show ever gives us, he's simply still there, having become, without any fanfare, exactly the kind of fixture in these people's lives that Talks must once have been in his. Institutions carry on that way, through one person after another stepping into a role somebody else eventually leaves behind, and there's something fitting about a show this obsessed with succession, of relationships, of park managers, of writers' rooms themselves, ending on the image of the two people who never left, Benson at his desk and Skips out on the grounds, still holding the place together long after everyone else finally got to move on. It's a fairly ordinary kind of image, honestly. An old boss still yelling about the flower beds, an old groundskeeper still doing his rounds, and I think that's exactly why it works as well as it does to close out a show built entirely on the gap between the ordinary and the extraordinary. 8 years of moon landings, cosmic gods, storm cloud girlfriends, and a wedding disaster still being argued about online, and the show chooses to leave you, in the end, with two guys who simply never stopped showing up. Not every ending needs to resolve every open question to land well. Sometimes the truest ending a long, messy, uneven story can offer is just proof that some part of it held, steadily, the whole way through, even while everything around it kept changing shape. Whatever verdict you personally land on about Mordecai, whether you're firmly in the camp that thinks this show let him down badly by the back half of its run, or whether you think that reading gives one bad wedding too much credit for defining 8 years of otherwise solid, ambitious storytelling, I hope tonight at least gave you the fuller version of that argument, the production history behind it, the specific episodes that actually support it, and the specific episodes that complicate it, rather than just the shorthand version that tends to circulate without any of that context attached. That fuller picture is messier than a title promising a clean season-by-season ruin can really capture. But it's the truer one, and truer, even when it's less tidy, is the version worth actually sitting down and telling, especially about a show and a character that clearly meant enough to enough people to still be worth arguing about, carefully and honestly, all these long years after the very last episode actually aired. Let's bring this all the way back to where we started tonight, to that wedding, to a Blue Jay standing before a whole room of people he's known for years, reading out a stranger's letter about honesty, and somehow turning it into the least honest thing he's ever done, breaking up with someone without so much as looking her way while he does it. That image is the reason this video exists, the reason enough people online still argue about this specific character years after the series ended, the reason a title like the one on this video gets made in the first place. And having walked all the way through the 8 years surrounding it, I don't think that image gets any less uncomfortable to sit through. It shouldn't. But I do think it gets less lonely as an explanation, once you can place it next to a Season 3 that earned its comedy honestly, a Season 4 that broke his heart without ever making it his fault, a Season 7 that proved the same writers could still do this material with real grace, and a finale that finally let him choose something for himself instead of just reacting to whatever life put in front of him. It's easy, when you're building a video like this one, to reach for the cleanest possible story, because clean stories are satisfying in a way messy ones aren't. He used to be good, then regular show ruined him, full stop, roll credits. And there's enough truth scattered through that version that I understand completely why it's the version people keep reaching for. But the actual 8 years, once you lay them out honestly, season by season, the way this whole video promised at the start, resist that clean a shape. They give you a real low point, one that still deserves every bit of the criticism it gets, sitting inside a much longer, much more uneven story about a friend group, and a show, and a production, all figuring out how to hold on to each other while everything around them kept changing. Regular show was never really a show about a park, or about groundskeeping, or even, in the end, about a will they won't they romance that took most of a decade to resolve. Underneath the moon landings and the magic keyboards and the storm cloud girlfriends, it was a show about a friendship that outlasted almost everything else the show threw at it. One that started with two guys avoiding a lawn mowing job and ended, 25 years later in story time, with those same two guys, a little grayer, sitting in the same park, playing the same arcade games, still choosing to be around each other. Whatever you think Mordecai deserved along the way, whatever you think regular show owed CJ, or Margaret, or the audience that grew up watching all of this unfold in real time, that friendship is the one thread this show never dropped, not once, across 8 years and 200 and some episodes. And it's honestly the part of this whole story I find myself thinking about most, long after the arguments about any one wedding speech have quieted down. It's a strange thing, looking back now, that a cartoon about two groundskeepers avoiding chores ever became something people cared enough about to argue over a single wedding speech for the better part of a decade after it aired. But that's really the quiet proof of how much this show actually earned from its audience along the way. Nobody spends this much time picking apart a character they never loved in the first place. Regular Show came out of a small student film, grew into 8 years of network television, watched its own production shift, and thin out underneath a creator who never let go of the wheel, took a real, honest swing at ending itself on its own terms instead of just fading out, and somehow, almost a decade later, got brought back again by a network still willing to bet that people wanted more time in this particular park with these particular friends. That's not a small legacy for a show that started as a joke about a magic keyboard and a moon landing. Mordecai's story, messy as it gets in places, sits right in the middle of that legacy. Imperfect in exactly the ways that make him feel like he actually belonged to a show made by real people working under real pressures, rather than a character engineered to be liked without complication. He let people down. He got let down himself. He spent years reacting before he finally learned, right at the very end, to choose something on his own terms. There are worse ways for an 8-year story to end, and there are worse things a cartoon can leave you with, half asleep, lights down low, than the image of two old friends still finding their way back to the same park bench, decades later, just glad to still have each other. Thank you, sincerely, for spending all these quiet hours here with Mordecai, with Rigby, and with the rest of this strange little park tonight. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.